Monsieur le Président de la République française.
President of the French Republic, my dear Emmanuel, welcome to the European Parliament. Today is an important day because we will have the opportunity to discuss the future of Europe with you. We'll be able to listen to your ideas, your proposals, and I'd like to thank you for having decided to take part in a genuine debate. We all know the rules of the game. We have a formal speech from the President. That's usually the case, but the President of the French Republic said that he wanted to hold a genuine debate with members of the European Parliament. So I'd like to thank you, President, for having decided to do that. Subsequent to what's happened in Syria, this evening we'll be holding a debate on the situation in the Middle East. So the Parliament is very much looking forward to hearing from you and discussing these issues with you. So once again, thank you very much for being here with us in Strasbourg, in your country. On the 1st of June we'll be holding an event when 1,000 young people will be coming to discuss the future of Europe with us. I'd invite you to come to discuss the future of Europe with these young people. You have a strong commitment to reducing the distance between institutions and our citizens, and that's something we need to work on together. We want to ensure we have a stronger Europe that is closer to our citizens. So thank you once again, President, for being here with us. Please.
Monsieur le Président.
Mr. President of the European Parliament, Mr. President of the European Commission, Commissioners, Ministers, honourable members. I'm very happy and honoured to be able to reply to your invitation, Mr. President, and to use this opportunity to engage in an open and free debate on the situation of our continent in a very special time. An open and free debate because I've already made speeches. There was my speech in the Sorbonne, and I think an exchange of views is essential in this place where each and every day you make our Europe come alive in all its variety, differences of opinion, agreements, and of course by putting together the compromises that allow us to make progress. The context is really rather special, and that's why our responsibility is all the greater. We have a context of division and indeed doubt within Europe. Brexit continues. It's still being discussed and worked on. Here I would pay tribute to the work being performed by Michel Barnier. But there is doubt in a number of European countries. And month after month we're seeing views and sensibilities emerge which call into question certain fundamentals. There seems to be a sort of European civil war. National selfishness and egotism seems to take precedence over what brings us together. There is a fascination with the illiberal, and that's growing all the time. I'm going to come back to this. There are geopolitical threats too. I'm sure we'll come to that in the discussion. So Europe has an ever greater responsibility. There are international conflicts. We're seeing that in the Levant and the Sahel, and we're seeing the emergence of authoritarian powers with a clear strategy which seeks to call into question the multilateral system where Europe takes its place. And that's, of course, the framework within which Europe can exercise influence. And that's also the framework we built up to establish peace. This debate is taking place at a time of great change and transformation. Digital revolutions, climate change and its consequences. And these also make us call into question the foundation of our industrial societies. They have led to fears and certain balances are being called into question. And I think we've got to rethink the way in which we act. So this moment, I think, makes special responsibility incumbent on us. We can't just make us carry on as if this was just any old debate, just standard debate. Because in the future, we must struggle to defend our ideals. And I want to share with you two deeply held convictions. If we decide to give up on democracy and on attachment to democracy and everything that goes with it, we'll be on the wrong track. We must also be clear that we must build a new European sovereignty which will give a clear and firm response to our citizens and show that we can protect them. We can give a reply to what they're concerned about. Indeed, in this world and in these difficult times, European democracy is our best chance. The worst possible mistake would be to give up on our model and indeed our identity. I dare to say here in Strasbourg and in Brussels, you make this European democracy come alive every day. And this is something mentioned by Tocqueville. This is a democracy that respects the individual, minorities, fundamental rights, which were used to be called liberal democracy. And I would use that term by choice. And there's also the deadly tendency which might lead our continent to the abyss, nationalism, giving up of freedom. And I reject the idea that means that European democracy is condemned to impotence. We're seeing authoritarianism all around us, and the response is not authoritarian democracy, but the authority of democracy. Because this freedom emancipates and frees individuals. Our parliament, this parliament, is a European miracle. It peacefully brings together the elected representatives of the peoples of Europe. You deliberate together, respecting difference, with the heavy weight of our history on us, the history which has at times divided us, and that is a unique model in the world. This is a treasure which we make come alive and which we have kept alive for more than 70 years. Let's not get used to it. We've taken all sorts of risks and gone through the very worst to arrive at this point. And to be even more specific, look around. Let's compare each other. Compare Europe with the other powers, which some are fascinated by because they allegedly are efficient. Where else in the world are there these same requirements? Financial, diplomatic, geopolitical, economic, this obligation to respect minorities, equality between men and women, respect for minorities, respect for private life. Where else is this so well developed in the world with this level of vitality and strength? Yes, there are divisions within countries and within this hemicycle. But over and above these divisions, this democratic model brings us together. It is unique in the world. The identity of Europe is more than just a democracy that defends freedom. It's a culture that is unique in the world, which entails a passion for freedom and, of course, attachment, diversity, ideas, languages, landscapes. This European model is neither dated nor abstract. It is embodied in our commitment to protecting the environment, the climate, health. It's also seen in our approach to digital, because Europeans are committed to innovation, but also protecting private life and privacy. This is an identity which makes us different from authoritarian powers, especially. But today, it also differentiates us from some of our closest allies. Our American ally, we share so much with that country, but this country is rejecting multilateralism, free trade, and climate change. I am convinced that this model is more powerful than ever, but at the same time very fragile, because its strength depends on our commitment, on our being demanding, and we must defend this model together each and every day. So to meet these challenges, the first precondition is truth. Now, people say that Europe, talking about united Europe means fleeing from responsibility, and people say that people don't want Europe. They propose golden roads, yellow brick roads, and they want to take their peoples off on an adventure. Others affirm that we shouldn't rush things too fast, that we'll be playing the game of the populists. That this is the familiar mood music of paralysis. We've got to be aware of the time and the time we have. I think all of this is terribly wrong. Stoking passions and not proposing alternatives, criticizing without proposals, criticizing without actually coming forward with arguments. People haven't given up on Europe. I think it's the treachery of the clerics that have done this. We've got to listen to the anger of people in Europe. They don't need lectures or education. They need a new project requiring efficiency in the day-to-day. And those that stoke this hate propose the cul-de-sac of the nationalisms that tore us apart in the past. We've seen the consequences in the past. So to breathe new life into European peoples, we must act differently and accept we must act differently, and we must go back to the origins of democracy. Let's look at things full on the face. Fewer than 1 out of 2 citizens vote in European elections. So over the next year, let's structure a proper debate on convictions, on proposals. Today, we cannot act as we did yesterday. And that's to not talk about Europe. Share out the seats. Accuse Brussels and Strasbourg of every ill. Carry on in this manner is a fool's game, which may well be more comfortable for all of us to engage in, but this will not solve any problems. Like you, I believe in the nobility and complexity of democratic choice. As representatives of the people of Europe, you incarnate this, you embody this, you make choices every day, you reach compromises, you put together solutions because you have the mandate of the people. And our shared challenge is to make this European democracy live and be alive. And that's why before the elections and before the election campaigns, we've got to make the debate come alive and create this European public space which all too often has been left aside. So it was with this in mind, to try out new things, to innovate, that I propose these citizens' consultation exercises as of this year. I'm going to be beginning this exercise this afternoon. It'll be an open and perhaps difficult debate, but a debate that is much needed to look at what brings us together and also what we disagree about, to get away from simplistic alternatives, yes or no, to a question which isn't really looked into, the implications, the presuppositions that go into it, or anything like that. What we need is a proper democratic and critical debate about our Europe. I welcome the fact that all member states have agreed to join in this initiative. I know that President Juncker and the European Commission is committed to this, so I'm most grateful to it. And I believe your role is very important indeed, Mr. President of the European Parliament. So thank you too. And I would invite each and every one of you in your countries, and indeed throughout Europe, to participate in this debate, to bring it alive. It's an essential debate because it is essential to keep our democracy alive. And the second conviction I would like to briefly share with you is European sovereignty, the need for European sovereignty. Defending Europe is not defending something abstract or the sort of dilution of our own sovereignties. Rather, it's noting that given the great changes in the world, the transformations, given these times, we need an even stronger sovereignty in what we have, something that is complementary but does not substitute our own sovereignty, something that in the face of migration, the lack of security in the planet, environmental and social changes, we can come forward with responses. That's the sovereignty I'm talking about, European sovereignty. It is this that I believe in.
Sur ce sujet, vous
You've done a lot on this particular topic, and I pay tribute to you. But between now and the end of parliamentary term, spring 2019, we need concrete results on a number of points. Migration. We need to unblock the poison debate on relocation and Dublin. We need to build external and internal solidarity in Europe, because that's what Europe needs. Therefore, I propose we create a European program that will directly provide financial support to local authorities that host and integrate refugees. Secondly, taxing the digital. Following on the Commission's proposal, we'll create a short-term tax that will put an end to the most shocking excesses. I support such a proposal. It is essential, and furthermore, I hope, pave the way for own resources for the future budget.
La réforme de l'Union.
Reforming the economic monetary union is another essential area for work before the end of the parliamentary term. We need a roadmap that will allow us to have a staged approach to banking union and creating a budgetary capacity that will allow for stability and convergence in the Eurozone. Finally, what keeps us together isn't just a treaty or currency, it is a feeling of belonging, a culture, in other words. And here I could cite the creation of European universities. That's making real progress. Or there's Erasmus. But I'd like to emphasize something that's still being worked on here. There's a house that's copyright, the protecting creators and artistic creation. This flourishing living cultures is part of the vital diversity of our continent, part of our genius. So on these four fronts, this Parliament has a very special responsibility, and you, I think, have grasped what France's position is on this. But over and above this, we need to build this full European sovereignty to protect our citizens in terms of internal, external and defense security. We've made a lot of progress in recent months, and here I pay tribute to the work that is underway in this House on the European Defence Fund. Given all the tensions we currently face with some of our neighbours, such as Russia, Europe has shown a united face that bespeaks its sovereignty. We must continue down this avenue. Sovereignty is also economic and trade sovereignty. Here too, we've shown unity, and I welcome the progress made in recent months on economic and trade sovereignty to defend our strategic sectors in investment. This at the Commission's initiative, an important step forward. And on the trade front, I'm sure we'll come back to this, we have a united position based on voluntary joining in, but which also protects our legitimate interests and the interests of our workers and consumers. I believe in this economic sovereignty, which is based on competitiveness, which countries build up through their reforms. There's also, of course, solidarity, which we must develop our economic monetary union, and of course we must have a more realistic trade policy. This is all work we must continue with. Sovereignty means climate and energy sovereignty too. That too is essential. We must quickly open up debate to increase the European contribution to implementing the Paris Agreement. We are completing the discussions on the energy and climate package, but it is clear that we must move on to a new phase. A number of you committed to this, and I hope that over the next few months we will reopen the debate on a flat rate or a price for carbon. France is in favor of a minimum price, and France is in favor of a CO2 border tax too. It's not a technical instrument. It's the way to ensure a credible energy transition. The fourth kind of sovereignty we need to take further is health and food. In our policies, in our budget choices of today and tomorrow, we must support food sovereignty, quality food sovereignty. That's what our citizens expect of us. That is what we owe them. It's good for our economies and our regions, and it's also a choice that is consistent with our longer-term commitments. The five area of sovereignty we need to defend is obviously digital sovereignty. Here I would pay tribute again to your work, which has led to something that crops up in all international debates. It's seen as a reference point in legislative terms. That is the way to protect the personal data of our citizens. For those who wanted illegitimate levels of protection, I would say we are becoming a unique geographical space in the world. We are encouraging groundbreaking innovation, disruptive innovation, but at the same time, we are protecting individual freedom. Finally, this Europe of equality and freedom is based on social values which we proclaimed in Gothenburg. This social Europe is a Europe of the sovereignty of this social basis. Now, of course, there are differences, but let's not feed difference. The meaning of the European adventure is increased convergence. That is why we have many of us fought very hard to regulate the posting of workers. Parliament has allowed us to improve the compromise reached in compromise, and I welcome the fact that this reform should finally be adopted and implemented. Here I would pay tribute to the work in this House. That's an image of a Europe that is efficient and protective. It's this kind of European sovereignties that need to be built. There must be at the heart of a coherent project and feed into the thinking on the multi-annual financial framework over future years. And I'll conclude on that point. The budget that we're going to discuss must be the expression of a coherent, efficient political project based on convergence. France is willing to increase its contribution. To do that, we need to completely recast the budget. We need to create new own resources. I'm in favor of that on the digital and on certain energy sources. We must get rid of rebate which cannot survive after Brexit. We must provide dignified funding to European funds on defence and migration. We must modernize policies and create conditionalities or convergence criteria on fiscal and social matters. No ambition level should be too high, but we must add new ambitions to this. And so that is what France will be doing over the next few months. We will be working in that direction. Ladies and gentlemen, I think you will have grasped that as I said, the European Parliament is the seat of European sovereignty, of its responsibility, and indeed of Europe being alive. It is here that the future of Europe is played out. Europe as a grouping of sovereignties that goes hand in hand with an even greater sovereignty, the sovereignty that unites us, a union at the service of peace and solidarities, which offers an area of stability and peace in the world. It is on this that we must anchor a Europe based on the spirit of its peoples. And I hope in future months we will overcome north, south, east, west divides, big versus small. We must overcome this inward-looking nationalist selfishness. I belong to a generation that never experienced war. I am part of a generation that is suffering the luxury of forgetting of the experiences of our ancestors. There are many who today believe we can continue with standard confrontations, the certainties of the past. We got used to them. Well-known divisions, well-organized divisions. But I also come from a family and from a region that has known and experienced all the tragedy of our past. So the choices are clear. I don't want to belong to a generation of sleepwalkers. I don't want to belong to a generation that's forgotten its own past, that refuses to see the torments of its present. Everybody must assume their responsibility. And I want to belong to a generation that has taken the firm choice to defend its democracy. It's not a word that we should become used to. It's a word with meaning, because it is something that emerged from the battles of the past.
Je veux appartenir.
I want to belong to a generation that will defend European sovereignty, because we fought to obtain it, because it has a meaning, because it is the condition that will allow future generations to themselves choose their future. And I will not give in to any kind of fixation on authoritarianism or fixation of presence. We need to show a sense of responsibility. And so, with that in mind, I want to organize real European debates so that our peoples can make real choices. Those who don't want Europe, who want a Europe that doesn't propose anything, a Europe that just carries on regardless. No, we want a Europe that is based on a living democracy, a Europe that we believe in, the Europe that we do believe in. Thank you.
Merci beaucoup, Monsieur.
Thank you very much, President. Now, before giving the floor to the President of the Commission, Jean-Claude Juncker, let me just recall that the system to register for the Catch the Eye procedure is open. If you want to ask for the floor, all you have to do is put your voting card into the machine and press one of the buttons for the electronic vote. I'll close the registration procedure subsequent to Mr. Jean-Claude Juncker's speech. You have the floor, President.
Parlement, Monsieur le Président.
President of the Parliament, President of France. Yes. Yes. We agree. I fully agree with what the President has just said. President, you, like the President of the Parliament, wanted to see a genuine, muscular dialogue between the President of France and the President of the European Parliament. So I'm taking the floor, but I don't want to abuse the fact that I have it. I'm from Luxembourg, I'm a European, and I want to begin by expressing my emotion and friendship when it comes to seeing the French President expressing himself in the way that he has. The true France is back.
Nous, Luxembourgeois, avec l'immense.
We in Luxembourg, with our characteristic modesty, say that Luxembourg is a small version of France abroad, and so therefore I welcome the return of France, and I want to say that yes, your election and your electoral campaign gives new hope to Europe, and I would like the ambition that you showed during the electoral campaign and subsequently be crowned with success. You can count on the European Commission to support you in what you're doing, and I would like to hope that we see the same level of ambition being shown by the President of France and the Commission. You've already shown that you have supported all the Commission's efforts to ensure that social Europe is not a dream but a reality as of today, and also one for the future, and I hope that others will follow you in the ambition which we share. You stood together with the Commission when it came to relaunching a Europe of investments, the Juncker plan as it was called back in the day. It's now called EFSI, and this has mobilized 273 billion euros of investments. 41 billion of those were invested in France. So this is a common shared approach which we took, and it's producing results. I would like you to continue to be involved in the fight for European commercial sovereignty. When it comes to international trade policy, I don't want to see Europe closing in on itself. I want Europe to stay open, but also we need to defend our interests, for example, in the steel sector, and there are also other areas where we need to defend our sovereignty and our industries. Together, we need to ensure that the gaps that divide Europe between East and West, for example, are closed. We need to rediscover a joint ambition. Europe can't simply be used to divide people and set people against each other. Europe is one whole.
Je sais l'importance que vous attachez à...
I know how important you believe that French-German friendship is. And geographically, historically, I'm very much in favour of the various rapprochements that have taken place between these two countries, these two nations. But let's not forget that Europe is not just France and Germany. We are currently 28 member states, tomorrow will be 27. And for the European engine to work, we need other contributions. We're not just French or German.
Je voudrais que nous ayons toujours...
I want us constantly to bear in mind, in addition, the fate of the people in the Balkans. We have offered them a European perspective. We did that back in 2003. I can't remember where it was, Greece, I think. Thessaloniki, a town I love, because I was given an honorary doctorate from the University of Thessaloniki, so I love that town, not only for historical reasons, but also for personal reasons. But anyway, in 2003, we decided to give the countries of the Western Balkans a credible European perspective. Now, I know there are many difficulties around this subject. The Commission will be discussing it today with Federica and others. But I'm not naive. I know that this is a difficult subject. I know that the efforts that the Western Balkans countries need to make. I know that there's a need for them to improve in certain areas. But if we open up to those countries in that highly complicated and tragic region, and if we open up a European perspective to them, or if we don't do that, we will see war returning to that area as we saw in the 1990s. I don't want to see war returning to the Balkans, and so we need to open up to them. To conclude, I support the President's approach when he talks about launching this citizens' dialogue. This is the extension of an initiative that the Commission took, which we called Citizens' Dialogue. I've been involved in many of them. We've held over 500 of them in all the member states of the European Union. I would encourage the French President, the French government, the Minister of Foreign Affairs to turn this into a massive event, not only in France but right across Europe. Europe deserves an in-depth democratic debate. The history of tomorrow is being written today, and I want us to write it together. Thank you.
Procedo ora alla chiusura del sistema per le.
I'm going to close the system for registering electronically for the Catch the Eye procedure. So the debate will take place as follows. Now we'll have representatives of the political groups, then we'll give President Macron the opportunity to respond to the initial interventions, and then we'll have the Catch the Eye procedure. I would ask all of you to respect the time you have available so that we can have as many members of the European Parliament intervening as possible. Let me recall that voting will take place at 1 o'clock. So let me immediately give the floor to Manfred Weber on behalf of the Group of the Europeans Party, please.
Mr. President, the European Parliament, this House, has waited a long time for a pro-European French president like you. My group is glad to have you here. France is a proud country, but you know France can only be strong if Europe is strong. You spoke today about the values of Europe, about our common union of values. And you are right. Secondly, to convince the Europeans it's important that Europe must deliver. Protect our borders, stabilize our euro, fight against terrorism, common defense, fair taxation. The list is long, and you can rely on the EPP as a strong partner on this agenda. Concrete projects and values. This has always been the approach for convincing people about Europe over the last decades. Then, why is Europe today so much under pressure and even in crisis? My answer is, people do not feel involved. The reality is that they see Europe still as an external power, not as their own project. The key question for the future of Europe is, who has the power? The people in Europe or some elite groups? To answer this question, we don't have to invent anything new. We simply have to practice what is the essence of Europe. What has been fought for over generations with blood, sweat and tears, we must dare to practice parliamentary democracy in the future. You spoke about democracy. I want to be a little bit more precise. What makes parliamentary democracy such a strong force? It gives people a say and brings them together. When my voice matters, I care, I engage, I belong, and I am willing to work for a greater, a common good. And what is if my voice doesn't count? Then it starts to feel like this is not my Europe. This is visible today everywhere, on newspapers' headlines, on Facebook comments, and on voting turnout. When you lose people, you lose Europe. It is good to knock on the doors of the Europeans and ask for their opinion on Europe. And many members of this European Parliament are doing this on a daily basis, to speak, to convince, to discuss with Europeans. But it makes, at the end, a big difference, and you know this. So simply stand in front of people and ask them of their opinion. Afterwards you can care or not. Or whether you stand in front of people and ask for their vote. Because then the people have the power. That's why we need parliamentary democracy. And now to be more precise. True democracy does not work just during the meetings of the heads of states and governments. Too often they postpone their decisions. Too often they only look for who is the loser, who is the winner, and about tomorrow's headlines at home. True democracy does not mean decisions are taken behind closed doors. True democracy means more than just a meeting. Jean-Claude Juncker already said this, just a meeting between Angela Merkel and Emmanuel Macron. The Franco-German axis is important, but it's not Europe. Europe is much, 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 much more. True democracy does not mean denying responsibility. Leaders and national ministers cannot keep blaming and shaming Brussels for their own decisions. And true democracy does not mean dividing us into good and bad Europeans. I respect the will of the voters in every member state, whether it pleases me or not. So, what is true democracy? Mr. President, just take a look around here. The chamber of the European Parliament is the right place to discuss about this. Every citizen is given a voice here. You can find communists, you can find conservatives, Christian Democrats, liberals, Green Social Democrats, and even right-wing extremists. Some people call this the old Europe. I call this the democratic Europe, where people recognize themselves with their concerns and needs, with their different views and with their representatives. The European Parliament is the political landscape of our continent, and we can be proud of this. There is no vote on a president of Europe. There is no European-wide referendum. There is simply only one event where all Europeans together are asked for their opinion on Europe. Political issues in Europe must be in the hand of the voters during the European elections, just as national interest issues are in the hand of the voters during the national elections. And for the same reason, Mr. President, the European Parliament is the only place to elect and to control the European executive bodies, the Commission, or I call it the government of Europe. This is why the people must be given the right to decide who will become the next president of the European Commission. Candidates must stand for elections, must defend their programme, explain to people what they stand for, and finally, they have to look for the support of a majority of this chamber, freely elected member of the European Parliament. This is how the German Bundestag works. This is how the Spanish Cortes works. This is how the Polish Sejm works. It is simply parliamentary democracy in praxis, which gives the power to the people. And let's call a cat a cat. Not a college, but a government. Not a commissioner, but a minister. Not a regulation, but a law. That would make things for people understandable if we would do so, ladies and gentlemen. And those who want to become a commissioner next year should probably run for the EP elections. Let the people decide who the government should send to the Commission next year. Other elements are equally important. A true democracy can only survive if it has common basic convictions. There is no French, German or Croatian way of life. There is only a European way of life. And we can be proud of this fundament. It's unique in the world. A true democracy in Europe also means believing in a vision. Politicians like Kohl, Delors, Mitterrand have made the impossible possible because they followed their European dreams. But again, the key question for true democracy is when this Parliament decides to freeze the negotiation process towards Turkey, then the process has to be really frozen, dear colleagues. When this Parliament is deciding about strengthening the external border, then Frontex officers have to be sent to the external border. And when this Parliament decides to introduce a free interrail passes, then the project has to see the light. So the people of Europe must decide, and we are representatives of the people of Europe, about the future of the European project. If we ignore the European peoples, the people will ignore us, and that is what we are facing sometimes today. So let us rebuild Europe as the most successful form of government ever invented by man, by parliamentary democracy. And I know this idea is not welcomed by everybody, but we have to overcome our trauma. Since 2005, we are discussing more about red lines and not enough about ambitions. The French say no more treaty change, the Germans say no more money, the Central Europeans say no more Brussels. I tell you, my main fear is not another Brexit. My main fear is a frightened Europe, and we will not be able to cope with the next crisis when we go on with this. So let's start now. Ladies and gentlemen, we have today the President of France with us. With his forward-looking approach for Europe, we can achieve a lot. The EPP is ready to work for a democratic Europe with ambitious projects, where the people finally are the owner of the European dream and the European future. As a young student, I was very much marked by the history of the Weiße Rose. Young people, students in Munich, the youngest was Sophie Scholl, 22 years old, were arrested by Gestapo in February 1943. They had used flyers to call for resistance against the Nazis. I quote one of their flyers. "The imperialist idea of power must be disarmed, whatever side it comes from, for all time. Only with generous cooperation between the peoples of Europe will it be possible to create the ground on which a new construction is possible. Freedom of speech, freedom of confession, protection of the individual citizens from the arbitrariness of violent criminal states, these are the foundations of a new Europe." Munich, 1943, 4 young people were executed for these ideas. This has always motivated me to carry on their dreams, dear friends. This has always motivated me to carry on their dreams, and I am sure they would be proud of what has been achieved during the last decades, a Europe of peace and freedom. And the task of my generation is now to build up a real democratic Europe, where the future is in the hand of the people of this continent, a true parliamentary democracy for Europe. Let us begin. Thank you.
A nome del gruppo dell'Alleanza
On behalf of the Progressive Alliance of the Socialists and Democrats, I give the floor now to Udo Bullmann.
We need a microphone.
Bienvenue, Monsieur le Président. Warm welcome from the Socialists and Democrats in these days, where the enemies of Europe, where those who would like to fight the European project shout out their hate. In these days, where fake news is governing whole countries, we need to certify and to reconfirm, yes, we need this united Europe, we need a strong Europe. And of course, somebody like you, having dedicated his own faith to his commitment on Europe, is very warmly welcomed in this House. Thank you for your courage. Thank you for your pro-European stance. We need that, and we would like to see more leaders doing the same. Just look at the slaughtering in Syria and what happened over the weekend. But please, this is a real case for a unified Europe. This is a real case for strengthening the European institutions. This is a real case for strengthening Federica Mogherini, the High Representative, the United Nations, and Antonio Guterres. So please work towards that direction. There is more needed than the action of member states. Look at the Facebook scandal. Look at the situation in Europe as well as worldwide. Data protection is on top of the agenda today. But as we need European institutions to strengthen our foreign policy, we need European legislation. Facebook needs European legislation. Facebook needs urgently the community method. And we, our group, the Socialists and Democrats, proudly lead on e-privacy, on general data protection. Please support us in the Council. And now, forgive me when I start to talk about the relationship between Paris and Berlin, I feel tempted to switch over into my native tongue. Herr Präsident, mit
Who do you wish to work with, Mr. President? Who is your partner? It is correct, in fact, that we do sing the European anthem of Beethoven, but it's not enough to be walking on the red carpet and sing the anthem. Rather, we have to make our dreams to reality. And when we discuss history in Germany, then Schiller, who wrote that text on this wonderful European anthem, he wrote this against the Napoleonic Wars. He wrote this against the fractured Germany. Rather, that this idea of freedom can only be realized in a community that recognizes equality and democracy. Let's go back to our roots. And when this European idea of universal freedom, if this does not create a world that promotes fraternity, then that is going to be held against Europe. And that is why we have trouble now. And that's what we have to overcome. So who do you want to work with? You have very difficult days ahead of you, sir. Mrs. No in Berlin has demonstrated how difficult it's going to carry out the reforms on the EMU. And all the mini Schäublers who are all lining up on this debate today in the German Parliament are not going to make matters easier. It's not going to make things easier. What have we learned from history? It's not intergovernmental action. Rather, we need a strong European Commission. We need a strong European Commission supported by a strong European Parliament. That is the only thing that is going to move the EMU forward. And that's how we see the social Europe. And, of course, I have a proposal with dealing with Berlin. Go to Angela Merkel and say, watch out, Angela. If you reduce the use of carbon, then I will reduce the use of nuclear power. I think that would be the best bilateral project that Germany and France could have to serve the European Union. You have chosen the right words. Europe has to protect its citizens. But then why are you blocking the package work-life balance in the Council? We have fought for this package. And what we want to achieve is that mothers can return to their job and they can decide themselves when do they want to be with the family, when do they want to be at the job. This is a very important action that we can do together. Why are you blocking the FTT when it's about fairness? Why can't we have Europe? Why are you blocking on the CCTB? Because at the end, how are we going to address the refugees? Are you certain what you're doing in France is really living up to France's dignity and the dignity of the EU? Social Democrats have been fighting for more than 150 years for a unified Europe of solidarity. This is not a Europe of the red carpet. It's certain that this is a Europe of universities, of jobs, of marketplaces. You have to decide, sir. If you're with the people, then you're going to find friends with my group. But then that has to be reality in our actual policies. We wish you all the best success, but we also wish you to make that decision. Thank you.
Vi prego di rispettare i tempi.
Could you stick to your speaking times, please, because otherwise you're taking time from other members. So now, for the European Conservatives and Reformists Group, Mr. Kamall, you have the floor.
Monsieur le Président, welcome. The European Conservatives and Reformists Group welcome a leader with a bold vision and the desire to shake things up. For too many national politicians praise the idea of ever closer union when in Brussels or in Strasbourg, but when they return home, their support for the European project of further political integration becomes a barely audible whisper. But, Monsieur le Président, what you say in Paris is what you have said here in Strasbourg, and that is to be respected. But when it comes to your desire to reform the European Union, the ECR Group agrees with the objective, but I'm afraid the devil is in the detail. Whilst we share your commitment to strong transatlantic relations, cutting red tape to help businesses create jobs, and the need for closer security cooperation, your vision of a European Union with a bigger budget, harmonised corporate taxes, unified social policy, common asylum system and a European Minister for Finance may be the right vision for France, but the ECR Group feels it is not the right vision for all member states. And while there will be many in this chamber who see you as the saviour of the European project of political integration, many outside this chamber do not want to see an EU dominated by just one or two large member states. They want national leaders to find common solutions which are agreeable to all member states. But what you propose, Monsieur le Président, is revolutionary. But rather than sleepwalking, to use your phrase, towards your goal, it should be presented to voters across the EU with an honest disclaimer, in large letters, bold and underlined, that member states will become less and less sovereign as the EU becomes more and more sovereign, as you wish to see. And all politicians need to be careful. You talk about temporary taxes, but I'm reminded of Ronald Reagan's line that there is nothing more permanent than a temporary government programme. The growing dissatisfaction amongst voters has not been because the EU has too little power, but because it has too much. And despite this power, it has failed to secure the greater stability and prosperity that was promised. Countries signed up for cooperation in key areas of mutual interest with their EU neighbours, not to see more and more decisions made in one city, the other side of the continent. Mr. Macron, we understand why you are seeking to regain the initiative. My group agrees that the European Union has drifted for far too long. But by returning to the 1950s agenda of political integration, you may be in danger of ignoring those who want an EU to face the challenges of the 2050s, not the 1950s. And that is why the ECR Group believes that the EU should facilitate nations to cooperate where necessary, but return powers to member states and local communities in areas such as immigration and social policy. But when countries do agree that an EU solution is the best solution, all countries should stick to the rules, not pick and choose as we saw with the Stability and Growth Pact or with a Dublin regulation on asylum. The ECR Group believes that common sense proportionate regulation rather than more political integration will allow businesses, farmers, fishermen and entrepreneurs to compete in global markets. But we also ask for more honesty. We ask that richer Eurozone governments be honest with their voters, that their taxes will be transferred to the budgets of poorer Eurozone countries, possibly forever. For that is the way that currency and sustainable currency unions work. Like your movement, Mr. Macron, the ECR was established to offer an alternative to the long-standing and stale political establishment in the EU. We've appreciated your honesty about your ambitions here today. And while I may be one of a number of MEPs who will not return to this chamber after the 2019 elections, the ECR Group will continue to fight for a vision of a reformed European Union. We will continue to oppose calls for ever more political integration. But where there is common ground, the ECR Group hopes to work with you to shape a reformed European Union, which respects all member states and their citizens. Let me just end on a more personal note. As our two nations, the UK and France, work together with the US in Syria, supported by our European and international partners, can I thank you for your cooperation and hope that our countries will continue to act as partners where it is in our interests to face global challenges together. Thank you.
Per il gruppo dell'Alleanza dei Democratici e dei Liberali.
Now for the group of the Alliance of Liberals and Democrats, I give the floor to Mr. Verhofstadt.
Thank you, Mr. President. President, colleagues, I'd like to pick up where Mr. Kamall left off. And before you reiterate what I said in this debating chamber, we unreservedly support the military action carried out by France and other allies in Syria. I think we have to say that because, dear colleagues, a colleague which uses chemical weapons against its own people is a genocidal and illegitimate regime. This is a reality we must face full on. But, Mr. President, I have to say that your speech shows your weakness too, because it is France intervening, the United Kingdom that intervenes and shoots missiles. It's not the European Union. 65 years after the National Assembly scuppered the European defence community, there is still no European army. And equally, we must say that our foreign policy, dear colleagues, is occasionally an illusion. This because of our lack of unity, because of the unanimity rule, which is still there in the EU's foreign policy. It is an aberration, and we must do away with it as soon as possible. This is a weakness, and we must recognize it. And it's not just restricted to our foreign policy. You use the word paralysis. Yes, we have this internally. If a country like the United Kingdom leaves the UK, it's difficult to say, well, hooray, what a success. And then we're also authoritarian drift in Hungary and Poland. The OSCE has recently published a report on the elections in Hungary, and I'll quote it: intimidating rhetoric and xenophobic rhetoric, biased media, opaque electoral funding. This is pretty much the same words were used by the OSCE when Mr. Putin was elected. Let us be clear. There can be no room for illiberal states in our union. Freedom of expression, the rule of law, equality before law aren't just liberal principles or from the Enlightenment, they're European values too. And we need to do something about this, because at the moment we're doing absolutely nothing. Manfred, I was much affected by the words you just used. The pamphlet drawn up by these young people in 1943, murdered by the Gestapo. You went to the heart of Europe's existence, and that's far better to quote that than send out congratulatory telegrams to Mr. Orban.
Alors, moi je pense que
I believe that this refusal to tackle the aberrations at Hungary, or this inability to act in the major conflicts in our neighbourhood, this inability to respond to the migratory flows, let's spell it out, is affecting us. It's affecting the economy. 9 months ago, or in 2008, when there was a financial crisis, Americans responded with a massive package, 2.5 billion worth of investment. 9 years down the line, we haven't yet managed to get our banks in order. We still don't have a banking union. We have not come up with a new governance for the Eurozone. I firmly believe, and I'll be candid about it, Europe is not ready for another financial crisis. If not, let us hope not, there is another financial crisis. We're not ready. And in this debate, Mr. President, we have to ask, what's not working in Europe? Why Do we have too little, too late, too weak? Let's acknowledge it. It's the intergovernmental system. It's based on unanimity, and that means that in a world that is getting faster and faster, we are doomed to inertia and failure. And let me add to that, it's been mentioned in the debate, we have these binary political systems within the European Union. This hasn't evolved. I don't just mean the two big traditional parties represented. I don't want to speak ill of them. They're our colleagues. But there's also the Franco-German axis. It's not in good shape at the moment. I am entirely in favor of having excellent relations with Mrs. Merkel, but the future of the European project cannot exclusively depend on a sort of random understanding between two heads of state and government. We need far more than that. And the Eurosceptics, there are a fair few here. You're going to hear from them. So far you're listening to the nice speeches. The Eurosceptics are not always wrong. No, it's true. They're waking up at last. Let us acknowledge that a large majority of our citizens feel exasperated at Europeans' inability to act. It's inertia. Citizens' problems aren't the European. They're bothered at the way we manage the European Union, and you rightly said or addressed this in your Sorbonne speech. How can we break with this inertia? We don't break Europe. We need to rethink it, reinvent it, refound it. And you reiterated today, real sovereignty is European. It's very brave of you to say that in a country which has always said, long live Europe, but with the French, because that's often been the sentiment. In the debate, Mr. President, you have broken away from what I believe to be a platitude. And you've done something quite incredible. During the elections, you managed to convince French citizens that their country is not sovereign if it just becomes inward-looking, but rather when society and its citizens take control of their own lives, on their own destinies. And you convince French people and this hemicycle that we need a new European project, a transnational project with a pan-European stimulus and impulse. And let me make one point in this debate. Persevere, carry on, because conservative forces in Europe are still powerful. Too many people say, "Oh, let's keep the status quo." It's more important keeping power than exercising power. And entre nous, I'd like to say that in talking about conservatives, SNCF is a bastion of conservatism, the French railway company, that is. But one point. There's one over there. Do not hesitate. After 2019, you're going to find the European Parliament with far more people that will support a generation that is truly European, that demands boldness. And in speaking boldness, I always like to quote Danton. He said, boldness, more and more boldness, and then Europe will be saved. Thank you.
On behalf of the Greens, Philippe Lambert has the floor. Thank you, President. It's good that France is back. It's been too long that its European seat was physically occupied but politically empty. Now, of course, Europe cannot be either French or German, but it cannot build anything durable if it cannot count on the true commitment of France and Germany. Now, France could, if it wished, embody the European motto of unity within diversity, within its own borders. Mr. President, the ambition that you wish for Europe overlaps the battle that we regionalists and ecologists have been fighting for a long time. We, like you, believe that Europeans have to act together if they wish to pick up the challenges of this century. That is where the key is of our true sovereignty. We share your will to build a political union which will give the floor back to the citizens. They've got to be at the heart of the European project, not on the outside. We, like you, want to give a future to our single currency, and of course this means we have to have a robust budget for investments. It means we need a common guarantee scheme for deposits, but also the end of fiscal competition. And finally, we agree with you that we should make our planet great again. You and we know that Europe has to be the champion of the green transition, starting with its budget that has to be the instrument for it. The environment and ecology is the key to our prosperity. President, what you desire for Europe, you're saying that France has to start itself doing that today. But your actions in France tell a completely different story, a story that is undermining the motto of your country: freedom, equality and fraternity. Where is equality when where's liberty where your citizens can be watched, put under house arrest and raided simply because of suspicions of the police? Where's freedom where armed police turn up in the morning to stop a group of young people whose only mistake was to peacefully sit in a construction site? My daughter was there. She, in front of her 2-year-old child, was interrogated all day, far away from her home. So France, that's a guarantee of our freedom, is actually getting further and further away from what it stands for. Freedom and equality. Where is equality when you impose greater uncertainty on workers, whereas at the same time you're giving tax breaks to the richest, those that you call the lead climbers? Well, your faith in this, your faith in the rope seems to be unshakable, but it's all about the rope that has to allow the first to go fast, but also prevent the last in the group from falling into the ravine. But this rope no longer exists. The rich are getting richer, the middle class are stagnating, and the most vulnerable have been left by the wayside. Freedom, equality, fraternity. The fraternity where you're selling arms to states who are using them against their own people or against their neighbours. Where's this fraternity where your police are ripping up migrants' tents and sleeping bags? You have non-suspensive appeals, you have expedited procedures. This is all about your asylum bill, where it's about containing and sending people back rather than welcoming human beings who've been forced to flee. Freedom, equality, fraternity. Well, isn't there a fourth idea, sustainability? You say that you're in favour of a carbon tax, the end of glyphosate and diesel cars. Yes, that's great, but at the same time you are promoting the free trade agreements and, worse still, nuclear power. Contrary to your predecessor, you allowed the EU to adopt a very laxist definition of endocrine disruptors. You were bold enough to put an end to the census airport of Aéroport de Lande, but at the same time then you are crushing the projects of those who've been trying to come up with a different way of living. President, there is a book that quotes you as being a philosopher. It says that none of your words is the fruit of pure chance. A few months ago you talked about people who are successful and those who are nothing. You didn't say people who do not do anything or people who have nothing. You talked about people who are nothing. Now for us, the European project is precisely about ensuring that never again, anywhere in this continent, no woman, no man can be considered as being nothing or can think of themselves as nothing, because considering human beings as nothing is allowing them to be submitted to anything, and we would never accept that. President, you offer your guests a present, but let me do the same. I'm going to offer you this climbing rope, the symbol of the climbing party that you seem so keen on. And let me say this to you. every time that you push forward towards freedom, equality and fraternity in Europe, every time you act for a fairer Europe, more sustainable, more democratic, we will be by your side. And if not, you will find us in your way. Thank you.
Per il gruppo confederale della sinistra.
On behalf of GUI Group, Patrick Leharric.
Monsieur le Président de la République.
President of the Republic, welcome. We have difficulty understanding your concept of a sovereign Europe when you took the decision outside of a European frame of discussion without a mandate from the UN and with your only allies as Mr. Trump and Mrs. May to bomb Syria. It's not acceptable, just as unacceptable as it is to have the use of chemical weapons by the regime in Damas. You cannot simply flout international law in this way. Even looking at the resolution from September 2013 against Syria, it references Chapter 7 of the Charter, which clearly states that the decision is one to be made by the UN Security Council. What's concerning here is twofold. If our country carries out these acts which violate international law, we are simply creating an international law of the jungle. Why do we have these two sides, these two measures? Why are we rushing to bomb in Syria without having the conclusions of the expert group when we do nothing in Iraq, we do nothing in Afrin, we do nothing in Yemen? We want to work on a project of a conference of peace, working together between Europe and the Middle East, including the recognition of the state of Palestine. If your project of citizen consultation is not just about opposing, if we just oppose those who are pro and against Europe, that's a very dangerous trap to fall into. There's another route, I think, which is more productive, having progressive transformation, ecological, supportive Europe. What we want is something new and modern, a new free association of peoples and states that is sovereign. This renewal should not hide the fact that we're moving forward in an ultra-liberal austerity direction. This is not democratic. This is why there are the problems in schooling, for example, in Europe that you mentioned, the problems of older workers in France, those with very precarious jobs now, who are suffering from a decade of austerity while large companies are making profits. For Europe to be able to protect them, we have to end this old dogma of competition, which allows tax and social dumping, leads to relocalization, which leads to less labor protection and destroys public services. What we want is a Europe based on solidarity. We need something innovative for all European citizens. Social security for work linked to necessary training that will allow a harmonization, an upward harmonization, and also housing for all. Europe is not providing protection when it goes beyond these free trade treaties that are destroying our social standards, our health standards, our environmental standards. What we would prefer is cooperation rather than this economic war. A new agricultural and food security policy to bring security to our rural areas, a fight against tax fraud and tax havens, and a tax on financial transactions. A Europe which is able to protect would not lead to refugees drowning in the sea or building walls, but actually holding out our hand to asylum seekers, as is proposed by a report from Parliament that I think could be very useful for your Interior Ministry. We want to protect workers and peoples and sovereignty, so we need to have the courage to emancipate ourselves from the domination of financial markets, to invent new mechanisms that can annul illegitimate debts, to renegotiate, to give us the means to effectively mobilize these large sums of money from the European Central Bank so that they can be used for the economy of the future, public services, environmental transition, digital transition, thanks to a human development fund that's also based on social environmental aspects. Such a fund would be a very useful tool to deal with the debt of the SNCF, for example, to have a common project for freight transport in Europe that would benefit the environment. This would be an excellent tool to boost our digital economy, to move away from the domination of the North American economy. The time has come to ask ourselves, is it time to revolutionize our European project to make it something that works for the people? Thank you very much.
On behalf of the EFDD, Mr. Philippot.
Monsieur le Président.
President of the Republic, I have far too great respect for your function to really actually welcome this exercise that you're embarking on. This assembly, the Parliament, it's not really a Parliament because there isn't a unique European people to represent, but nevertheless this assembly meets primarily in Brussels. If you talk about the European religion, then you curry favour. If you talk about other things, not so much so. Now, of course, you've always been very wise in talking about the rich, the wealthy. I mean, they can, of course, get on their own, off their own motion, but who can we please here? Those who perhaps lecture us, those who for so long have confiscated power, those who for so long have turned their back on the people? Well, actually, the jury is here, right here before you in the European Commission. They judge you every day and they will give you a grade. I can assure you straight away your grade will be excellent because your speech basically took up all the canons of the European Catechism. So the jury will give you a good mark when you talk about European sovereignty. Of course, it is a fallacious argument. How else could you possibly undermine national sovereignty unless you go down that road? The Commission will also encourage you with your agenda, the liberalisation and destruction of public services, a total opening of borders, disregarding the risk of migration, disregarding the risk of terrorism, and of course any kind of trade protection is seen as something irrational according to you. Now, today, for once, you spoke in French, which was perhaps not customary for you. Very often, when you speak in public, you choose to leave behind the language of Molière, the French language, and you speak the language of the Americans. But nevertheless, I'm sure you will still curry favour with the Commission because you're such a good pupil, you're such a good student, you're happy to follow the policies of the lobbies and the Commission. You're a bit like Matteo Renzi or Tony Blair. You're very much, a favourite in Brussels. And you talk about reforming the European Union. You're already failing in that regard. You're already disappointing us because the EU is not reformable by way of its structure, and therefore you have failed when it comes to glyphosate, when it comes to the secondment of workers, and that's why I'm afraid I'm sad. I'm sad. France is an old nation, and leading that nation is a noble function. I don't think that this is the right way to go about it, just parading yourself as the top pupil of the class. President of the Republic, please do not fall for the lobbies, for the technocrats. The world here is actually the old world already. What about the world of tomorrow, the world of people who will hold their heads up high once again? I think you need to move with history, be on the right side of history. The British peoples have already decided to break free, break their chains. Yes, the British people, whether you like it or not, sovereignly voted in favour of independence and freedom. Freedom and the future of the European Union. Well, the European Union is the past. Therefore, President of the Republic, I urge you to talk about France and talk about France as a free country like President Chirac did in 2003. He was strong enough to stand up to the United States and say no to them. In a recent interview to the BBC, you talked about the hypothesis of a referendum of Brexit in France and the fact that this referendum could actually not succeed. Well, let me put you to the test then. Make sure that French people have their freedom, their choice. I think it's worth more than some kind of getting together with Brussels, getting together with Berlin. After all, our nations are civilizations. We are brilliant civilizations. Will always be much, much better than any European treaty. So yes, let us leave the European Union. Let us enter into the world. And Mr. President, if this prospect doesn't please you, well, then I suppose you could always move back to the European Commission, perhaps be recruited by Goldman Sachs or something like that. I think you would just be moving up in the echelon. So long live Frexit and long live Free France.
On behalf of the ENF, the floor goes to Mr. Bay.
Monsieur le Président.
President, if you've been able, without too much difficulty, to make us not regret your predecessor, François Hollande, and your recent decision to follow the US in a unilateral military strike in Syria, well, maybe we'll be wishing Jacques Chirac was still here, because at least he had the merits to say no to the US and their belligerence. Have you not learned anything, you and all the others, from Iraq and Libya, from these interventions that were justified at the time by moral considerations, but which ended up simply fomenting war, chaos, and allowing the jihadists to prosper? Are you not aware of that? And that in France, like Syria, it is also the worst of the Islamists who've applauded your strikes. In the international arena, like elsewhere, you're very far away from the new world that you'd like to embody. Around you, in your fortress, you have all the beneficiaries of the old world, this lost model, everyone who simply wants the status quo and yearns for the global village. You are supposedly moving forward, but isn't that what Edith Cresson, the Santon Delors, isn't that just ever less democracy? It's a Europe suffering amnesia with no borders, no identity. You like to flaunt your supposed modernity and communication skills, but actually you are running counter with the future. For economic and environmental imperatives, for a more human world, this century will force us to come back to our limits and borders. Whether or not the unbridled free trade zealots like it or not, it's now about free trade of arms and terrorism. On Sunday evening, you said that France had to be more flexible and more mobile. Mobility and flexibility, these are the buzzwords, all about advertising and communication, but they're just spin very far away from real politics and what we need. What we need to guarantee is a sustainable France and sustainable nations in Europe. The people have spoken, Mr. President. Listen to what people are saying in the UK, Austria, Italy, Poland and Hungary. But listen to what a lot of French people are saying as well. These people want their economies, their businesses, their jobs to be protected from unfair competition. They don't want seconded workers nor free trade agreements. Only a small minority benefit from these to the detriment of the real economy and the people who are suffering. They want to put an end to this borderless immigration, endless migration. They want to reclaim their sovereignty, in other words, their freedom. Yes, people want to be able to decide for themselves. In the past, that's what we used to call democracy. People are expressing their rejection of the EU that wants to decide on everything, but shows itself to be completely unable to meet the challenges that it's facing. It's all about deregulation and overregulation. Europe's absent in technology innovation, in food security, in artificial intelligence or protection of personal data. The EU, however, is omnipresent when it comes to encroaching on the freedom of nations. You want to speed ahead with nations who do not share your view, and according to what you're saying, who are laggards. But advancing to what goal? To what? More European integration, less economic regulation, more immigration and communitarisation. With you, and I'm sure you have the support of Mr. Verhofstadt, it would be Europe without Hungary, but with Turkey. It seems impossible to me to imagine a Europe which has a renaissance, not taking into account the need for rooting, as Albert Camus said when he talked about Simone Weil's work, The Philosopher. Yes to a renaissance, yes to reforming Europe, and that has to be rooted in our nations, in our civilization, our common civilization. That's the challenge of identity that we are all facing together. The identity of the nations is not a weight. On the contrary, it is a weapon for us. It's a shield in globalization, and it could be a fantastic vector of success. European of cooperation and protection, that is what people want. Europe of the nation. And that's where we're going to be meeting at the ballot box in 1 year.
Alla parola.
And now, CHAUPRADE for the
Monsieur le Président de la République,
non-attached.
c'est à vous.
President of the Republic, I address you with all the respect that the President of France deserves and who is putting in place courageous reforms. You, as myself, want to give a future to France and Europe. It is going through a profound crisis of illegitimacy. Europe, this civilization of freedom, will be nothing tomorrow if it's allowed to be erased by demographic realities. You quoted Stefan Sniff when it came to Africa. You quoted some figures. There are 500 million citizens in Europe, 100 million on the African continent. It will be 450 million Europeans versus 2.5 billion Africans, so 5 more. When we look at future demographics, 3 out of 5 will be born in Africa. Your Interior Minister spoke of being submerged by migration. Immigration is bringing more dependence than active workers. It's destabilizing our societies. It's tearing our heritage that we have from centuries of struggle. What we need to do is to create more productivity. We need to have more mobility within the EU. We need to boost European birth rates. We need to digitalize our economies. We need to focus on robotics and artificial intelligence. President of the Republic, our freedoms are the product of our civilizations. It's clear what we hear from Budapest, Prague, Warsaw, Vienna. If we neglect the signals that we get from the peoples or governments of Eastern Europe, this will be very dangerous for the future of Europe. You, as President of the Republic, you have talent, you have courage, so when it comes to the fight for modernity in France, you also need to add the essential fight for the future of our civilization. The French have a lot of expectations when it comes to this, and so do many Europeans.
President, you've got about 10 minutes if you wish to reply to the first round of questions that have been put to you by the groups. You may take the floor right away if you wish.
Du Parlement, merci.
President of the Parliament, ladies and gentlemen, members of Parliament, thank you very much for allowing me to experience something that the French Constitution doesn't really allow me to do usually, namely a debate with Parliament. I was a minister once upon a time, and I particularly enjoyed this exercise, I must say. I'm not going to pick up on your different points chronologically, but I would like to pick up on some salient points that have been mentioned. First of all, when we talk about sovereignty, and whether we're talking about nations, peoples, European peoples, I think there are a couple of clarifications I need to make. I'm surprised to hear you say what you've just said. This assembly that you're meeting, you were elected to this assembly by the French people, sir. It's very strange to treat the French people in this way, disregarding that particular point.
Alors, si cette assemblée...
So this assembly, if you didn't really like it that much, perhaps you shouldn't have come. That's all.
Il fallait aller à d'autres élections.
Perhaps you should have stood as a candidate in other elections. Perhaps you should have submitted yourself to other exercises. And as for the project, the real French project here, I mean, French people chose that project in May last. You were defending your project. You lost, that project lost, because the French people decided otherwise. The French people decided for this.
Mais, néanmoins...
Nevertheless, you are expressing anger here, and I've said this time and time again. We need to hear this anger, and I do hear it. I've always said that. I always have respectful debates with various people in the campaign, Madame Le Pen included, and that's why I'm afraid I cannot subscribe to this facile argument saying this is what you should do in the country, all these foolish points that I in fact addressed in my interview on Sunday last. This is the legitimacy of the French people we're talking about here, and that's why I'm here. But of course there's also all the demands coming from the French people, and therefore I simply cannot accept your view, your analysis of what is happening in my country. First of all, the Constitution, a country that did not wait for the integration of fundamental freedoms. You know, we have the preamble of 46, we have all these values enshrined in that text, and we have a constitutional council that can address matters and see whether or not our laws are in conformity with the Constitution or not. Now, you talked about the possibility of putting this to members of parliament or pre-ruling questions. You know, this has all been done as should be done, and therefore there are certain steps that need to be complied with, and they have been complied with. Now, from my own vantage point, I have been courteous enough to listen to you carefully, and therefore I would ask you most respectfully to please listen to me whilst I speak. This is a democratic exercise. You represent peoples, I represent peoples too. We are both representatives. The law on security and on the rule against terrorism is a law that is intended to fight the problem of terrorism, and that is why it allows certain measures. It allows for the protection of public spaces, and I stand fully behind it, 100%. I am the president of a country that has been attacked many times by terrorists, and I simply could not explain to my people that we're not going to stand up against this threat, simply because people like you are propagating fake information about people who are harming our country. And I think the whole Parliament and the whole Constitutional Council is with me on this one, and therefore for Parliament or for Council I simply cannot allow you to say these things that you have said in this chamber. I'm afraid I simply cannot let it go unanswered. Similarly, you talked about Notre-Dame-des-Landes, that project, and given that time is brief, I shan't dwell on this, but let me tell you, we've taken some courageous decisions, and I think it was very important to put a stop to a project if that project was not in conformity with our objectives. But there were people who were demonstrating against that project. Is it all right for them to demonstrate? Is it all right for them to attack the police forces? Agricultural projects, even the most innovative ones, they're still there, and there are people there who are defending that and who are acting lawfully. But if you want legality, if you want fraternity, you have to abide by the Republican order, always.
Vive la France et vive l'Europe.
Yes, long live France, long live Europe. When you talk about free France, what exactly are you referring to? If you're referring to the same thing as me, then fine. Then we certainly have our platform here. Anyway. Moving on to migration, migratory flows. Several of you mentioned this in the debate. This particular subject, and you're quite right to talk about the figures, Mr. Smith. We know that, of course, the roots are very deep, and we're not going to be able to resolve this through some kind of national policy today. It's not possible, and therefore, looking at the causes, looking at the fact that we need to settle stability in Africa, we need to fight against terrorism, and that is precisely what we're doing. We're doing it in the UN, we're also doing it through the French intervention in the Sahel with other states. We want to have an ambitious development policy, because that is the only way of ensuring that we have development, that we have emancipation of all peoples in their countries, and incidentally, Europe, time and time again, has supported that through the Marshall Plan and elsewhere. This is what we're doing. We're doing this through the Alliance for the Sahel, we're doing it through our policies, and that is our objective. We want to increase our help to development aid. We want to make sure that we reach the target by 2022. And there also is a question of solidarity within Europe and outside of Europe. That is the key if you want to have an overarching solution to this issue of migration. Earlier on, I spoke about this aspect, and Council and Parliament will be looking at it very closely in the months to come. I deeply believe that we need European solidarity at our borders to protect us, but also a solidarity within our borders. And I have submitted a proposal to that effect. There are many others. We want to make sure that we share the burden together. France, in this domain today, is happy to see cooperation with many other states, Germany and Italy in particular. I would like to take this opportunity to commend them on their efforts. Together with Italy, we've been able to demonstrate over the last year our ability, our capacity to work together. Now, similarly, and as I said earlier on when I spoke about cohesion, I'm also standing behind other reforms which are currently underway. We want to make sure that the right of asylum is effective in nature. I've always fought for that, and I will continue to do so. At the moment, you need 14 months before you get your asylum rights in France, 6 months in Germany, by way of a comparison. So the whole purpose of this reform, as supported by France, is to make sure that we have convergence in our system towards the German system, in particular, our neighbouring country systems, in terms of organisations, in terms of deadlines. I think that the French system right now is not up to the task. We have long delays. We also have an issue of asylum versus other forms of migration, and in particular, we're not really able to welcome people, men and women, who come to our shores as they should be, those who are asking for asylum, those who are asking for refuge and protection. Now, I talk about sovereignty, I talk about an effective Europe, and I do that because I'm not in favour of turning in on ourselves onto the national core. No, I'm not in favour of that, and I also refuse some kind of other approach where we would forget our principles and where we forget about the cohesion of our peoples. I think that there is, Chesterton, I think, put it very well. He said, real idealists are pragmatists. Look at Robinson Crusoe. Great ideas, a journey. He set off with, I don't know, a bit of cheese, a bit of ham, and then he organised himself to keep going. Robinson Crusoe, why don't we take that as an inspiration? How about that? Several of you also mentioned some other key points that are essential in terms of the workings of Europe, and if I may, within the time slot allocated to me, I'd like to touch upon them briefly. First of all, and here I turn to the President, the Balkans. President of the Commission, Balkans. I think on that chapter we need to follow two tacks. First of all, we need to be pragmatic, and my first point therefore is yes, we need to make sure that the Balkans are brought closer to Europe, because there is a geopolitical risk right before us. The Western Balkans, if they were to drift away towards Turkey, towards Russia, that would be a risk. Or if they were to collapse, indeed, if they were to be so divided that they simply collapsed. So we need to make sure that we give them prospects. We need to make sure that we tie them closer to Europe, and that is an essential project. That said, enlargement, I will only be able to defend enlargement once we've had a deepening reform of our own Europe right now, and that is our ambition. I think that both of those tracks need to be pursued. I don't want the Balkans turning away, turning towards Turkey, turning towards Russia, but equally I don't want a Europe that is, finding it difficult to operate with 28 member states, tomorrow 27. We might then continue, would we have 30, 32 in a couple of years' time with the same rules? That's simply not feasible. And talking about rules, I personally am convinced that we need to have pragmatic rules. If we want to move forward, then I think we need to accept that. And several of you talked about the Franco-German couple. I, in my speech, never spoke about the Franco-German couple. And I was quite struck by your response, your reaction. I think it's very much rooted in history. Of course, I feel very strongly about our relationship with Germany, but I don't by any means think that that is Europe in itself. It's not all of Europe. We need to have, of course, a minimum level of agreement between France and Germany, failing which we would take a long time moving forward and a long time taking Europe in the right direction. Having said that, and sometimes I know that I have been swimming against the current, I have also felt that sometimes you can move forward with a hard core, as defined by ourselves. I've seen several European leaders with real ambition over the course of the last few months, smaller countries or eastern countries or whatever, putting things in those terms. No, we have a project, the logic of a project, but let us move together. And if there are those who don't want to move with us, well, don't let them stop us from moving forward. I think it's important to remind ourselves of the rules that have been already flagged by others in the past. More ambition and also more qualified majority voting, not necessarily always having this blockage. I think that's fundamental in itself. Then, other institutional aspects, for instance, the role of Parliament and parliamentary democracy. I really, really believe in parliamentary democracy, strongly so, and that's precisely why I wanted to meet with you, why I wanted to have this exchange with you. I also believe in the separation of powers. If you have a constitution, you have a separation of powers. In constitutions, in treaties, you have responsibilities that incumbe upon the Parliament, those that incumbe upon the Commission, and those upon the Council. And if you want to change that, you have to ask the people if they want to change this. So saying that this particular competence would go from one to another, that's not something that we can do so easily. I believe in parliamentary democracy, I believe in the freedom of expression of the peoples, and that's precisely why I want to suggest transnational lists. If you believe in the vitality of democracy and of the peoples, you You shouldn't just believe it when you get together with parties for elections, with a rate of turnout such as the ones we're seeing right now. That's not it. We want parliamentary democracy, we want a big parliament. Well, for that we need big turnout as well at our elections. We want our debates to be genuinely European, and we need to really move towards transnational lists, and the leaders of those lists could be the Spitzenkandidaten that we've heard so much about. Now, that said, on that particular argument, I think it's a little bit strange to then just stop suddenly, abruptly, and to only believe in parliamentary democracy if we're talking about existing structured parties with primarily national logics. Let's be honest. I see that time is running away with me, and I know that the President of the Parliament has been quite strict about speaking time. Let me briefly touch upon a few other points, perhaps two, to conclude. One, Syria, which I'll come back to, and then the other one is the budget, the European budget, and the ambitions that we would like to support in that regard. I think a higher budget is not necessarily a problem for our fellow citizens as long as we are able to organize ourselves. The European ambition, several members spoke about this earlier on in the exchange. A stronger European budget in order to support our new ambitions, in order to also support our historic ambitions and the European sovereignty that I spoke about. I don't think that's in competition with national budgets or in competition with national sovereignty. I really don't think that. If you look at the energy transition, if you look at digital aspects, trade, migration, for all of these chapters, all of these challenges, we need a European response. This debate, we have national debates, but it's not sufficient. You gave us a good example, the regulation on the protection of data. There was no point in enacting such regulation purely at domestic level, national level. There would have been, loopholes. The operators would have gone to, I don't know, the Netherlands, Belgium, Germany. They would have gone somewhere else. So you need to do this at the right level, and that's exactly where you pitched it, a level where you can actually be on an equal footing with big corporate players. So I support both sovereignties, national and European, because both are complementary. And then finally on Syria, a few words. This intervention by France, the United Kingdom and the United States of America, it has nothing to do with Iraq, it has nothing to do with Libya, for a very simple reason. We haven't declared war on anyone, and we did not intervene declaring war on anyone. Let me be clear. But it's the same principle which underpins what I'm telling you throughout. If you believe in multilateralism, if you believe in the force of law and of what is right, then at some point in time you have to decide that you cannot simply cave in to the cynicism of those who do not support that, who do not support multilateralism. Now, to be more specific, because this subject, I know, we're not going to be approximative on this issue. We need to be clear. We have a coalition, an international coalition, a diplomatic one, a military one. We've joined forces together with that, and we're fighting against Daesh, against Islamic terrorist groups which have attacked us and which have caused hundreds of fatalities in our countries. So that is perfectly legitimate. There is a framework, and we are fully involved in that war. But that is the only war that we're engaged in Syria. But there is another war, a parallel war, the one between Bashar al-Assad and his peoples and his opponents. For 7 years this war has been going on. We haven't declared war on Bashar al-Assad. I've said this time and time again, and the interventions that happened a few days ago have not changed that fact. But there is ongoing work, constant work, humanitarian work, diplomatic work, in order to defend our values, and I fully stand behind that. Resolutions that have been adopted by the UN, in particular September 2013, yes, you're right, it talked about the possibility of recourse to constraint, and incidentally President Putin, when he came to Paris, subscribed to that. That was less than a year ago when I presented that particular red line, namely use of chemical weapons. There are international texts. They do condemn the use of chemical weapons, and that resolution was quite clear. All the permanent members of the Security Council stood behind it, and there was a clear commitment vis-à-vis the regime of Bashar al-Assad. But on multiple occasions, that particular provision has been flouted. Several members of the international community community have organized themselves in order to make the UN unable to act against the use of chemical weapons. Since November 2017, the mechanism for restructuring has been sapped, and any resolutions that would have wanted to go further have been undermined. So it's the same people, those who are shocked by the images that we've seen of children, women who have been attacked by chlorine. Let us, the same people, we need to stand up, we need to defend our rights. What are we going to say? Our rights just for us, principles just for us? What about reality, real life? That's for everyone else? No, that simply isn't acceptable.
Dans un cadre qui est bien...
So the framework is very clear, very precise, and I would like to remind you, we are at war with terrorists. Bashar al-Assad is at war with his peoples. 3 countries have intervened, and let me be quite frank, quite honest, this is for the honor of the international community, making sure that within a legitimate framework, a multilateral framework, in a very targeted way, and without any human victims, not a single human victim, to destroy 3 sites where chemical weapons were being produced or processed. That is what's happened. So let's look at our principles, let's look at international legislation, and let's ask ourselves our question, where is it we want to head? These strikes don't necessarily resolve anything, but I think that they are important because there was a system which we had become accustomed to, where what was right seemed to be the weaker position. I'm not happy with that. I will not accept with that. We will continue, of course, with our diplomatic efforts in the Security Council. We will continue to work against chemical weapons, their building, their construction, the Russian veto, of course, we know about. In the UN, we will continue to work to make sure that there are humanitarian evacuations in Lib tomorrow. Unfortunately, we will continue also with our work on the ground, and I said that yesterday. France will invest 50 million euros in order to support non-governmental organizations who are active on the ground, and I would put out an invitation to all countries to join us in this humanitarian effort. And finally, we want to work towards an inclusive political solution, talking to all parties, Russia, Turkey, Iran, the regime, and all the opposition forces as well. We want to make sure that we can build the Syria of tomorrow. We need to repair this country. It is so essential. But we won't be able to build the Syria of tomorrow if we just turn our back on this, if we turn our back on Bashar al-Assad and letting them get on, and these people get on with the work that they have been doing that has been so negative. Thank you, and I apologize for being so long.
Merci beaucoup.
Thank you very much, President. We're now going to begin with a catch the eye, and please make sure you respect the 1-minute speaking time, because otherwise I won't be able to give the floor to many speakers. We'll start with Mrs. VALEAN.
Thank you, President. I was taken by surprise. So, domnule președinte,
President, I represent a country which French people love a lot, Romania. Europe of the future, President, is a Europe in which no one is left behind. This is why discussing a Europe of several speeds creates confusion and weakens citizens' trust in the European project. Beyond the theoretical debate on the future, we live in the present, so we must act now. We must build a multi-annual budget oriented towards growth and investment, and I congratulate you, President, for your engagement for bigger contributions from France. We must take very seriously the implementation of the legislation we have. We must fulfill our commitments, and we must all solve our internal problems before we try to talk about other people's problems. Each member state is important for the solidity of the European Union. You cannot have a strong structure which has weak pillars, because the future of Europe does not solve the present problems of either of us. Thank you.
I was also surprised. President of the Republic, you speak like a convinced European, a European in enhanced or augmented reality. That might be enough for some of my colleagues here. However, on 2 occasions at least, you've only looked at the virtual aspect of these European references. In February 2018, the French government voted on the common asylum policy, but the title is deceptive. Was your intention then to use the European umbrella to justify very unfortunate provisions such as being able to arrest or detain anyone, including children? So this is effectively destabilizing. And then the issue of the deadlines, we might come back to this, but that is certainly not the problem, not where you consider it to be. And in the meantime, the reform of the Dublin regulation is suffering because member states are blocking negotiations, and France is being particularly rigid. That's not what I call a European approach, and I very much regret that.
Van Orden.
Mr. Van Orden.
President, good morning, and thank you for your very interesting address. In terms of defence and security, France and the United Kingdom have been the closest and longest standing of allies for over 100 years. Don't you think that in the economic and other fields it would be helpful if France could more strongly signal its support for the EU to have as close a partnership with the UK as possible post-Brexit, recognising that this will require novel arrangements? Thank you.
Honorable Omarjee.
Monsieur le Président, merci.
Thank you very much, President of the Republic. Our world has gone into a process of de-civilization and savagery. We have to call on our conscience here. As Europe is now, it's simply indefendable. Europe is simply accommodating the extreme right and calling into question fundamental rights. This is not something we can defend. The Europe of defense is preparing the path for war. Fortunately, the Europe of defense is not ready yet. If we look at the isolation of France in its warlike adventure in Syria, it's not defendable because Europe, which is meant to be a Europe of the people, has become a Europe of the rich. What we would propose is another path forward, moving away from this type of thinking, moving away from these ideas based on what the people need. When you talk about European sovereignty, this is something which is impossible by nature. Sovereignty, as you know, belongs with the people.
Honorable Lundgren.
Mr. Lundgren.
Thank you. Thank you, President Macron. Your main asset is really your oratory skills. You are a very good rhetorician, it has to be said. I'm still fascinated by the movement in the elections. You promised everything to everyone. You promised that you would unite the left with the right. You also promised that you would be able to guide the people into the light where everything is beautiful and warm. And then, of course, we were confronted with reality once you were elected. And you've lost a lot of support in France, it has to be said. Your ambition, you have an ambition and I have an ambition too, but my ambition is not to make sure that Brussels or the European Union take power over my country. That's not my vision. My vision is not that we should be sat here in this chamber and take decisions on particular provisions that we could actually resolve much better back in our home countries. That's not my vision. But I believe in my own country. That doesn't mean to say that I don't believe in Europe as such. I believe in a Europe where we're friends with our neighbours, where we have trade agreements between states, where we have a different system to the one that we have today. That doesn't make me a worse person than you, Mr. Macron. Thank you.
Honorable EPITIDEIOS.
Grazie, Presidente.
Thank you, Chairman. President. President of the French Republic, I'd like to welcome you here to the European Parliament. In a recent television interview that you gave, you said that you have convinced President Trump that he shouldn't withdraw American troops from Syria. You've also given the order to your own military forces to take part in the Hollywood-style intervention that we've just witnessed in Syria. So, my question to you, in terms of this failed intervention that we saw last week, have you actually achieved what you wish to achieve, or actually have you managed to ignite the anger of all Arabs, in just like your intervention in Mali and elsewhere? And finally, why are you continuing talks with Turkey? That's not about excluding Turkey. You seem to be pushing them to stick to their European commitments.
Señor Presidente.
President, we are currently having a debate on the future of Europe, and so I would like to ask you your opinion with regards to regions that would like to be new states within Europe. We're talking about the sovereignty of Europe, and I completely agree that the challenges of the future are the challenges of a more sovereign, strong Europe. My question, though, is this national feeling of sovereignty that we have across Europe, and what you think with regards to the future of Europe, how this can be built when there are regions that would like to be new separate states away from the member states. What is your view when you look at these people's demands?
Onorevole Proust.
Mr. Proust.
Au nom de la délégation française du PPE, bienvenue.
On behalf of the EPP French delegation, welcome to you and thank you for being here. And thank you for launching your electoral campaign here, because this afternoon in Épinal, I believe you're going to be embarking on the citizens' consultations. So you're going to have a wonderful administrative machinery behind you. Now, the question in the next few months isn't about whether we're for or against Europe, but rather what kind of Europe do we want, and what our fellow citizens want is to be closer to Europe. So my question to you, President, how are you going to reinforce that proximity? And France, you've leapt 20 years back by taking out the regional constituencies, and I know you want to impose the transnational lists. In the Council, you tried to impose appointment of the Commission President outside any kind of democratic process. Now, I know that you want to take root in terms of European ideas, but my idea is that you're on your own. And contrary to your majority in France, here, European democracy is done by consensus. So, President, if you continue as you're doing, I'm worried that your new movement in Parliament won't be moving forward, but actually at the margins of any decisions and results we're trying to achieve here for our fellow citizens.
Onorevole KAILI.
Καλώς ήρθατε, κύριε Πρόεδρε της Γαλλίας. Θα μιλήσω ελληνικά. Σε ένα Ευρωκοινοβούλιο που δεν είμαστε μόνο.
Thank you very much. I will be speaking in Greek. In a European Parliament, we're not just French and German, but there are also Greeks, Spaniards, many different countries which are footing the bill for these military interventions without any kind of planning or preparation. President, are you proposing something specific for economic governance? What kind of solution is there? Are you going to support the role of the European Parliament if we have a European Economic Fund in which the South would be more than simply a good client of the North? We have good cooperation between us, so what do you think is the ideological antidote for this? What political family could we put forward? How could we progress with these more progressive ideas? Thank you.
Mr. LIBERADZKI.
Panie Przewodniczący, Panie Prezydencie, witamy serdecznie.
Thank you very much, President. President, good afternoon. You spoke about European universities, and I would have a specific proposal to make to you. This European University, why don't we create it here in this building of the European Parliament? It would be a way of meeting that demand. We would have one seat only for the European Parliament in future in Brussels. Second comment, I wanted to also pick you up on solidarity, European solidarity. The Macron law is well known by now. We've been talking about seconded workers. I was wondering whether that too is deemed to be an expression of European solidarity in your view, or is it in fact something that expresses the interests of wealthier nations to the detriment of poorer nations? Because there is a divide in Europe between richer and poorer nations, and I fear that solidarity is not expressed through that law.
President Macron,
good morning. I think that alongside all the topics that have been dealt with, there's one that I consider to be central and key, namely our businesses, European companies, development, the economy, and the work of European businesses in a context where war of customs duties and tariffs between the US and China is predominating over any other logic. So I would like to know, what's your opinion with respect to the strategy that Europe should employ? I think that at the moment we need to be able to move forward then on trade agreements and to focus on our Made in Europe, and also protection through rules against anti-dumping on steel, aluminium, all of these situations that make people understand that it isn't just about populism. It's not just about a false understanding of situations. So it's our responsibility, our duty as a united Europe to protect our companies, particularly small businesses, those that are suffering, and in particular those that are not able to compete internationally. Clearly, in this kind of situation, it would be important to hear from you whether sovereignty has to prevail in this sector or not. Thank you. Mrs. Valenciano.
Thank you very much, President. In this chamber, in my group, nobody has any doubts about stopping the use of chemical weapons from Assad's regime. So you certainly have all of our support. But has it been sufficiently effective? Has there been full European support with the sovereignty of Europeans? Will this attack actually change the course of the war? Or will it rather, President, be better for us to have strong diplomatic action so that we can get all the parties around a table so we can move towards reconstruction and peace in Syria? Wouldn't it be more useful to try and build European support for these diplomatic actions, for this decisive diplomatic action that can avoid pain and suffering in Syria?
Onorevole McGuinness.
Mrs. McGuinness.
Thank you, President. 5 years ago, President Macron, the Irish President, Michael D. Higgins, said the following: Europe is a legacy that cannot be taken for granted. Citizens yearn for the language of solidarity, commitment to cohesion, for inclusive rhetoric that is appropriate for an evolving political union. And I think you echoed those words. But we evolve through disagreement, and we will be judged by how we solve our disagreements. You heard this House. There are many voices. I might take a different view to you on taxation. I'm from Ireland, but I don't want to talk about detail. I want to talk about the middlemen between citizens and the European Parliament, and that is national parliamentarians. They are not always the friend of Europe. Some of my own colleagues do not speak about Europe in a positive way. And we have a job of work to do, those of us who are pro-European, to persuade our elected representatives in national parliaments that there is not a fight between the European Parliament and national parliaments. There is not a power struggle, that together we can be stronger. Will you join us in that fight? Thank you.
Onorevole Berès.
Mrs. Berès.
Merci, Monsieur le Président.
Thank you, President. President of the Republic, welcome here in the European Parliament. Whether we're pro-Macron or socialists, we need members of the European Council who can do a good thing for the cause of Europe. The President of my group Udo BULLMANN, presented a deal to you that's Franco-German, but I do think it's a good Franco-German deal, nuclear for coal. You didn't reply to him, so I'd like to give you an opportunity to do so. On the issue of economic and monetary union, I think all the ideas are on the table. We share many of them, but there are more and more obstacles, including those that we've seen this weekend. If you want to make progress, you need those people in the European Parliament who know that it's only with the community method, not with national egotism, that we can advance. So what place do you consider you're going to give to the community method and this Parliament, as a Parliament of the Eurozone? Mr. Gasperi.
President, congratulations. You won the elections thanks to the theme of Europe, and people are dissatisfied with the EU. Some people would like the EU to keep its nose out of things. Others would like to see more Europe. If you talk about social issues, well, in my country, 25% of the people who thought that Europe should be more about social policy, there should be a communitarization of social policy, but 75% of people also wanted to address asylum and refugee policies. They wanted a common law for the whole of the EU. They wanted the same procedure for the whole of the EU, so I hope we will move towards that. 3/4 of the people in my country would also like to see a better common security and defence policy. Now, it's been agreed that we're going to have a development of a fighter jet by 2040, but surely that's a ridiculous deadline. Surely should we be moving that forward and do it sooner? If you look at the budget also, 10,000 Frontex soldiers, 600 million euros that would cost a year. That's a little bit more than €1 per citizen. And if we had that, we would be dealing with an issue where people have expectations vis-à-vis the EU. We would be responding to that. So I would be really pleased to see not just words, but actions in that regard. Thank you.
Oh, yeah.
Mrs. Toia.
Macron,
thank you, Mr. Macron, for having come here. I think your merit is that you've reawakened the European dream and you're swimming against the tide when we've seen so much anti-Europeanism. This is a great merit, but at the same time it's a huge responsibility, and every choice of yours, every act is going to be measured in terms of coherence and effectiveness. Now, it's true there are divisions, first of all, between pro-Europeans and anti-Europeans, or those in favour of national sovereignty, but that isn't the only divide. I'd like to know, President Macron, do you agree penalising the Europe that protects the workers, the environment that we all want? It's not enough just to be pro-European. We need other choices on the European Guarantee Fund, against austerity, against relocation, migration, for defending the rule of law. We in the S&D are in the front line here, and we'll continue to do so, but there are still many differences between conservatives, progressives, and many other choices. So, President Macron, how are you going to choose with whom you will engage in trying to realise the dream that we all share?
Riquet.
Mr. Riquet.
Monsieur le Président.
President, I'm from the French delegation of ALDE Group. It is important that you recalled the values and sovereignty. You were the only candidate recently in Europe. At a moment of risk, you chose to promote these values for the legitimacy of the people. Now, there are some in the Assembly with different views, but a majority of the people here would like to see more Europe. Let me just highlight the fact that Parliament is normally an integrating tool, but Council can often be a brake in terms of the European machine, and it's not always the easiest to get our files through. I hope that you will inject the same enthusiasm when it comes to convincing your colleagues in Council to follow the integrationist trends from Parliament. But thank you once again for recording us what is really important for the people, and that's Europe.
Marisa Matias.
Mrs. Marisa Matias.
Obrigada, Sr. Presidente.
Thank you very much, President. President, you represent France here, and you have I think, depicted a situation which is not very much in sync with what I'm experiencing. I mean, do you think that we're living in democracy, or is it just a word? We need more democracy. We need genuine civic democracy. And yet, only a week ago, that principle was broken, almost unilaterally, through this engagement, which is very dangerous, and without consulting anyone whatsoever, without putting it before any parliament, before receiving the approval of the French parliament even, never mind the European ones. Is that democracy? President of the Republic, you speak about the need for democracy, but in your discourse it seems to be absent. It's a very Napoleonic approach that you adopt. What we would like to see is genuine democracy. We would like democracy to be a remedy, and it's not through weapons that it's going to happen.
Honorable Rangel.
Mr. Rangel.
Monsieur le Président, je me félicite.
President, I'm delighted to have heard your fine words on European policy. However, we have our differences. I have to say that the transnational lists increase the distance between the voters and those who are elected, and that there's no federalist experience with the transnational list. It doesn't exist in the US, nor in Switzerland, nor in the Federal Republic of Germany. So if we're to have good integration, we do not need these transnational lists. Now I'd like to ask for your support. Your support for an idea that we have in terms of a report with national parliaments that we're going to debate tomorrow. Namely, we should create a European week to take place at the same time in all 27 parliaments and in the European Parliament, with an exchange of view between commissioners and representatives from all nationalities and the national representatives. That's the European Week, and I would like your support for that idea, which we will be voting on Thursday. Thank you.
Onorevole Viotti.
Mr. Viotti. President Macron, I'd like to thank you for having spoken of the need for new solidarity internally between the member states of the EU. But can I remind you what's been happening at the French-Italian border for months? Ventimiglia, Bardonecca, Montgenèvre, and other places as well, where the French police is acting at the boundary of legality by pushing away refugees, pregnant women, children, making them get off the trains. I'd like to ask, do you know about these facts, and is that the internal solidarity you understand? And then finally, a suggestion. In fact, may I invite you, in terms of the political consultation you're talking about a lot, don't create any new families. We've got sufficient families. The invitation is to come to the next meeting of the European Socialists, and you'll see that many of our programs have a lot in common. Thank you. Mr. Bütikofer.
Thank you, President. Herr Staatspräsident, zur europäischen...
President, you have spoken of European solidarity. This also includes energy policy and the issue of Nord Stream 2. This is something which divides European member states. Nord Stream 2 is something that would increase dependency on Russia, and at a time when you have clearly stated that it's very important that Europe has a clear common position when it comes to Europe. This Parliament, in its majority, rejects Nord Stream 2. Will you support us in getting rid of this false project?
Thank you, President Macron. The Greek people have been listening with great interest to your address, the one that you pronounced in 2017, in Athens, in fact. President, every day Turkey is full of provocation towards Greece. It is violating territorial waters, our airspace. Mr. Erdogan is even asking for an amendment to the Lausanne Treaty. This is a threat. He has also imprisoned 2 Greek soldiers. President Macron, I would therefore like to put the question to you. In terms of the French Republic, are you going to sign an agreement, a pact with Greece for the strategic defense and for a pact of non-aggression as well, in order to deal with this aggression coming from Turkey vis-à-vis Greece? We need the commitment of France in order to protect the borders of Greece, which are the borders of Europe after all. Why? Because of these threats from Turkey against Greece, which are growing stronger every day.
Mr. Frunzulică.
Onorevole Frunzulică.
Mr. Frunzulică.
Aveva insistito per parlare.
Now you wanted to speak, Mrs. Arena.
Beaucoup. Monsieur le Président, oui.
President, thank you. I also wish all the best for the European Union, for a united and strong European Union. A European Union that has a global democratic power with global interests. At the same time, Mr. President, allow me to disagree with your two-speed Europe. That's going to be very dangerous for Central and Eastern Europe. We cannot once again have these two-speed Europes then between Western Europe and then Central and Eastern Europe. Mr. President, we need a united Europe based on solidarity. Thank you. Mrs. de Lange.
Merci le Président. Merci.
Thank you to the President of the Republic for having come here. I think you'll find a lot of people on your side.
Nationalistic and romantic but often dangerous visions of the 19th century of those who believe that they can go at it alone. I believe that cross-border challenges ask for cross-border and European solutions. You have spoken very little about the EMU and the banking union, and I do believe it's very important to reassure those constituents, especially in my member state, but also others, who say, of course, France also has some homework to do when it comes to reforms. You've been one of the few presidents that have actually said out loud that France needs to reform before we can take steps at a European level, and I thank you for that. I think it's refreshing. But can you reassure my constituents that you will be taking those reforms at home to an end before we take steps at a European level? I look forward to your answer, and thanks again very much.
Onorevole Wikström.
Mrs. Wikström.
Grazie, Presidente. Thank you, Mr. President, for having brought back hope for the future, hope for the Union to citizens all over our member state. In the last Eurobarometer last year, citizens pointed out that they want Europe to deliver on climate change, on combating terrorism, and on migration. We are delivering on everything except from asylum at this moment. Now we need to change that. I am the rapporteur for the reform of the Dublin regulation, and I count on your support on moving from the Dublin, as we know, to an instrument worth the European Union in the 21st century, based on fair sharing between member states, based on solidarity, and based on a modern mechanism that is up and running in days of low influx and high influx, an automaticity that is necessary. If we deliver on this, we can meet citizens in the upcoming elections in 2019, and being strong together. I still believe that it's possible, and I count on you, Mr. President, because still I believe that this Union, we have our greatest victories ahead of us and not behind us. But we need you for that. You will be crucial in that development. Thank you very much.
Onorevole Arena.
Mrs. Arena.
Monsieur le Président.
President, I am really very disappointed that during your speech, during your responses, you didn't talk about gender equality at all in Europe. gender equality in Europe today, which is experiencing serious difficulties, whether it's in Hungary, in Poland, or just in general when it comes to representation at work, the pay gap, gender violence. You simply haven't spoken at all about this discrimination. So let me give you a third opportunity, Mr. President. Perhaps you could tell us what France's position will be when it comes to the Commission's initiative on a work-life balance, on parental leave, which will finally allow mothers and fathers to balance their family and work life and to give the best start to European children in this way.
Mr. Belet.
Monsieur le Président, bonjour. J'aimerais vous...
President, good afternoon. I'd like to put a question to you in Dutch, please. You talked about the protection of people. We agree with you, of course.
Een van de fundamentele prioriteiten daarbij.
It seems to me that one of the greatest priorities concerns European defence and the construction of European defence. The Belgian government has been given some thought to this. The F-60 bombers, for instance, that would be replaced now by US aircraft. I'd like to know what initiatives you have in mind vis-à-vis the Belgian government, but also other partners in the European Union. How can we persuade them? How can we convince them that they join forces with us when it comes to a European project? In other words, European defence, to do procurement together. How can you convince them?
Onorevole Grappini.
Mrs. Grappini.
Mulțumesc, domnule președinte.
Thank you, President. President Macron, you are a pro-European. I'm also a pro-European. I'm behind you. Here I am. I'm also a pro-European, and I congratulate you on what you said today. But I think you contradicted yourself on one thing, and I would like you to clarify. I agree with you that we need to have not an authoritative democracy, but to have the authority of democracy. This is very important. Don't you believe that your declarations on the fact that Germany and France must be the hard nucleus of Europe, somewhere above the other member states, does this not lead to Euroscepticism? How can we convince citizens in my country, Romania, that we are all on equal footing when you speak about a Europe of two speeds, when you want two member states which are above all others? How are we to reform Europe, which you've spoken about, if you want this discrepancy among the member states? Thank you.
Thank you, Mr. President. President Macron, thank you for your speech and also of being active and passionate and energetic, which you have, and that energy you have brought to discussion about Europe. We appreciate that in my home country, Finland. You talked a lot about sovereignty of Europe. Of course, that's an important thing, but only to a certain limit. It shouldn't mean protectionism or turning inwards. On the contrary, in these times when we have internationally difficult times, it's important that Europe takes a stronger role as a global leader, promotes peace and prosperity, is active when it comes to FTAs, and promotes international commitment-based cooperation, for example, when it comes to battling climate change. I especially like that you emphasized the importance of European democratic values and that all member states should be committed to these values. My question is, in the Council, what will you do to make sure that all EU member states follow and commit to European values at the moment, in this moment and in the future? Thank you.
There are two more speakers. Mr. López Aguilar.
Señor Presidente, Presidente Macron.
President Macron, a lot of us liked the energy of your responses, and when you talked about the complexities of democracy, that's very important when we deal with populism, and also the importance of democracy and what we need to do with illiberal democracies. President Juncker said that tomorrow's story is being written today, and time is running out. The 2019 elections are a test. First of all, the balance between liberty and security. we are dealing with terrorism here, something that we have suffered so much from in Spain, but we also need to preserve the free movement of citizens, something which European citizens massively appreciate. We need to see increased resources to the EU budget to ensure that the next budget has own resources, that we have a tax on financial transaction that we've called for time and time again at the European level. We also need to have a no-holds-barred fight against tax havens.
Monsieur le Président, je veux tout d'abord rendre...
President, first and foremost, a tribute to France, which is playing such an essential role in the fight against terrorism and also trafficking in human beings in the Sahel. I've just come back from Niger, and I would like to thank France. They would like to thank France for protecting them. I also acknowledge the role played by France for peace in Europe. We need to continue to respect that, but we also need to make sure that citizens are on board, or at the very least we need to understand why it is that today we can't organise things in a way that is closer to the citizens or at lesser cost. I'm not expecting an answer from you today, President, but I am expecting you to be open to listen to these voices from around Europe who are asking, why is there so much waste? Why don't we have a more efficient Europe, a more consistent Europe, one that preserves our planet, one that is also in line or in tune with the Paris agreements? We need to make sure that we make that constant effort. We need to make sure that we work for this together, over and beyond political cleavages. We need to make sure that we also work for this as European Parliament, and we believe that a courageous leader such as you will not be closing the door on dialogue. We're confident. So let us start that debate without any kind of taboos, without any kind of preconceived ideas. We need to make sure that we act together to build their future. Thank you, President.
Bene, grazie.
Well, thank you. I know many other members would have liked to take the floor, and I apologise for not being able to give it to everyone, including those who wanted it, but the debate has run far over time. There will be further opportunities to take the floor, so I really apologise to all those members who were waiting to be able to put their question to the President of France. And I'll now give Emmanuel Macron the floor right away to hear your replies. Thank you, President. Thank you very much, President. Members, I'll try to sum up questions to all the replies to all the questions that have been put. There were questions on migration policy. First of all, to say that everything happening between France and Italy isn't happening at the behest of one or the other, but in perfect coordination. And I welcome the perfect agreement we have between our two countries to manage the migratory flows. And the situation, which you've quite rightly recalled, are always very difficult in human terms, are very worrying, and of course they require us to act in a very humane fashion and to coordinate our efforts. So today I'm delighted with the exemplary relations between France and Italy that I hope will continue. Yes, France did enact reforms at the beginning of the year at the initiative of our parliamentarians to allow us to support the Dublin regulation despite its shortcomings, and I agree with that. But no longer applying it at all was unacceptable for a country such as France, which today has thousands of people in refugee camps, despite the fact that they have received a rejection. In Germany, for example, we've got between 50 and 60% of people in France, refugees in France, in particular in the Parisian region. They are called, and I don't like this term, Dubliners, as in from neighbouring countries. If we do not get the current system to work, however flawed it is, it's unacceptable for a country like France. So, yes, we've taken a realistic approach, a pragmatic approach in the last few years, and I will continue with that. But the question is, how do we reform the system? Of course, I'm not satisfied with it, and I agree that today it isn't up to the task of the migratory challenge we're facing. First of all, we need greater harmonisation of the rules. That's what we want to do, in particular with Germany and Italy. Harmonising our rules means that we can have much better coordinated management of how we receive the refugees, and I think we can draw inspiration from what our German neighbours have done. The timing for asylum and dealing with irregular situations, can I ask you to look at the rules that prevail in Germany now that are even more radical than what's being proposed by France, however, with underlying investment to help the receiving populations and those people who get their papers. That's what we want to do. So we're moving towards this cooperation in the short term through the law. And then, of course, there's the European phase, which I believe is the most effective here. And to reply to many of you, I'd like to defend greater solidarity at our external borders. We need European investment to protect European borders and to not leave the burden to the countries of entry. That reform is essential, without which we cannot tackle the migration that we're having that's likely to continue in the future. And then moving towards a common asylum system, I'm in favour of that. We're trying to coordinate the situation today. I'm in favour of a common asylum system which would have the same rules across the board, all member states. And finally, we need rules for an internal solidarity. There's quite a lot of thinking on this matter, and we've seen just how difficult it is. The policy that was essential in the state of emergency for relocation, if we want the rules and the laws which in the future will allow us to rise to this challenge, I'm in favour of us having some financing for these solidarity policies. That's why, together with others, I think we should have an agency to finance the local authorities who wish to receive and integrate refugees. We can see just how difficult it is in the national debate. We can see some cities as well who are prepared to take these steps. However, we have to have European solidarity to finance the reception and the integration policies for these refugees. So you've understood, I think we need greater convergency, internal and external solidarity, and having the same common rules. In the French debate, however, what we're failing to see is that the problem we've had for decades is that we don't receive people well. We make everyone wait. We have the longest deadlines, or asylum takes the longest as anywhere else in Europe, and at the same time, those people who do not qualify for asylum, we don't know how to deal with them. So we're in a situation where we're not able to receive anyone well, we're not able to integrate anyone, and we're not able to do anything with the people who don't get their papers or status. Now, I cannot defend the system. I don't think it's fair or effective. Now, I agree that at the moment, some people are saying we're more unfair because we're tougher with those people in a regular situation, but we hope to be able to better receive those in a regular situation who have a right to asylum. And then you've asked me about Brexit, and I have a direct reply to France's position with respect to the UK and the post-Brexit situation. I'm in favour of the most integrated relations, the closest relations. And there is a solution, we're very familiar with it, and that's EU membership. It's the situation which allows perfect access to the single market, access to the freedoms, and a very good integration. Now, I know one thing, and that is we cannot promise something to the people and then claim to give them the opposite. There are going to be negotiations. Michel Barnier is conducting them under a council mandate, but I think there's one thing that's very important. I'm very fond of our friendship with the UK. We have bilateral relations in defence and management of our common borders. But there's no cherry-picking in the single market. That's a simple principle. I believe in Europe, and therefore I believe in what we've done. The freedoms in Europe based on solidarity, and full access means full respect to these freedoms of European jurisdiction and contribution to the budget. And then we know the different formula, but we've got to be consistent in the choices we make. That's what democracy is about. It's about explaining the what-if scenario right to the end. There's a lot of people proposing what-if scenarios, but they're not explaining what happens the day after. And then it's all about reality that has to be understood. Then on the principle of regions in Europe, I heard what you said about different cultures, and Europe has to respect that. But I also believe in a constitutional framework in which these cultural expressions exist. And clearly, you yourself, many of you here, are your parliamentarians, your European parliamentarians elected from different countries, France, Spain, and elsewhere. That sovereignty is expressed in a state. So that's my reply to you. Yes, we have to respect cultural specificity and the wealth of our diversity, but it has to be done in a democratic framework. It has to be democratic. And that presupposes that we respect the constitutions that our people have chosen, whether you like it or not. But these constitutions cannot be cut up. Sovereignty cannot be unravelled unless the people decide to do that. And then, quite rightly, the link with the European elections. I have received all different political groupings in France before taking my decision. First of all, the regional constituencies. Did they bring France closer to Europe and allow greater participation? No. What was the opinion of all political groups? To have one national constituency apart from yours. Now, I know you're defending that here, but I have to be honest and say you were the only ones wanting that. Everyone else wanted a national constituency, taking into account the fact that the constituencies that France had up to now did not correspond to any political or administrative reality, nor local identity. As you know, they'd simply been artificially cut up, and the only coherency was the phone directory, which was about 30 years old, and I don't think that corresponds to the reality of France, either yesterday, today, or tomorrow. So that reform was something underscored by almost all the political colours in France. I think it was the right one. I believe in the Spitzencandidate system. I think it's very good, the lead candidate system. Now, today, I'm not part of any family group that you represent here. Well, that gives me freedom, and it's very in line with the spirit of the French Constitution. And with that freedom, it's my right not to have to get into your own political debates. It will be for the parliaments and the political families to do that, and I respect them, but that's not the preserve of the European Council nor of the President of France. So I think it is progress that the existing political families are proposing a lead candidate, Spitzencandidate. In fact, I think if we'd been more democratic, we should have come up with a European demos. If we'd been coherent and pushed the reasoning right to the end, then that Spitzencandidate would have headed up a European list. I'm not against them. I'm just not in favour. Well, I'm not a member of a political family in your European Parliament. Let me just say to the person who put the question that all the states you cited are federal states. These have federal lists, and you're quite right to say they're not transnational, but that's because they're already federal. If we want to start thinking about federation, then clearly we have to have transnational lists. These would be truly European lists. There would no longer be national lists bearing European values. I think it's important to draw that distinction, because otherwise that might give rise to the wrong interpretation. And then several of you have talked about a Europe that provides protection. Well, that's the very principle that I wanted to take to the European Commission when I took up office. And some people have gone along with my motto. I do believe in a Europe that gives protection. That's the basis of sovereignty. Sovereignty means protection and the ability to express your voice amongst the nations and at international level. And in fact, it's our pact that means citizens believe in us. So yes, a Europe that gives protection. I've defended that in everything I've said and in my actions. And it's also in the name of a protecting Europe that I very much welcome what you're doing, and that I want greater, more ambitious reform of the work on the posting of workers. I think that's something people can understand, much more than electoral lists. It's nothing to do with our political mechanisms here that people are interested in. They're interested in any responses we can give to their daily lives. European citizens is not just the background, but that's the very substance of what we do here. So protecting Europe is how do we deal with social dumping in Europe. Let me speak frankly. If we defend a reform of the Posting of Workers Directive for a protecting Europe, then of course that's in line with European interest. We're not betraying European history at all. You who put the question to me, today it's not about fiscal and social dumping to make Europe progress. Now, I think that if we believe in Europe, we have to take note of the fact that we have ambitious policies. I defend those, whether it's agriculture or cohesion. Now, look at these policies. Look at the fundamental philosophical underpinnings of these policies. The idea was to make countries converge towards a European standard. For years now, we have accepted that these policies are funding alternative models in some places, i.e. fiscal and social dumping. So we're using cohesion funds to bring down taxes or create niche tax situations to attract companies, or to attract unsustainable models, or to pay workers even less, pay them very low wages to attract companies to Europe. Now, I very much believe we need to strengthen European competitiveness. In fact, I'm conducting such reforms in my country, but I believe it's impossible to engage in such policies if at the same time we're not trying to push for greater European cohesion and hence convergence, and use our directives, our law, and use the money we invest in our budget to allow for that convergence. So I believe in protecting Europe. I believe in a Europe of convergence, particularly when it comes to tax and social areas, and fighting against aggressive tax planning and the non-cooperative stance of our countries. You've also asked me about trade policies. You raised the tensions that exist, and I agree with what President of the Commission Juncker said. I believe that in terms of our trade policies at multilateral level, there are rules, and it's the WTO rules, and I don't believe we should just go it alone at national level. These rules create the conditions for growth. However, I'm not naive, and that's why I've defended the strategic sectors that need to be defended. I don't think we can simply invest in all sectors without thinking in all countries. Well, look at what's happening in other countries, even those that are members of the WTO. They've always defended their own strategic interests. And I don't think we should be naive here. And finally, I think that our trade policy should be fully in line with our other objectives. The free trade agreement with Canada had been negotiated. The competence was a community one, after all, and it could have taken it even further. However, it was decided to send it back to the national parliaments. A lot of work was done in the French Parliament to allow for an improvement to be made to the text, and to ensure that before the text was ratified and throughout its application will be in line with our requirements, particularly when it comes to the climate. The Canadian Prime Minister will be speaking before the French Assembly this afternoon, and he'll be able to echo his adherence to these principles. Now, I think that in the future, our trade policy has to show consistency. In other words, any environmental, social and health concerns of ours has to be borne out in the trade negotiations. It simply isn't possible to negotiate any new treaties where we open up trade lines with certain areas or countries that either don't want the Paris Agreement, or they decide that their social model is based on dumping or any either aggressive tax planning. So we might be defending trade, but it's simply not consistent with our environmental, social and tax requirements. Now, many of you have raised the issue of Syria. Let me just say that no European taxpayer today is financing those targeted strikes on the part of France. It's the French taxpayer paying for that, just to clarify the situation. And then democracy has rules. It cannot just be rules that we find convenient. The President of France is also head of the army. That's according to the French constitution that was adopted by the French people. So the President of France has responsibilities and can take certain decisions. According to the constitution, the President then has to inform the national representation. That has been done. We even decided there should be a debate. Each country, according to its own constitution, has its own rules, but you cannot lecture me about democracy, telling me that you don't like the French laws. After all, they've been decided by the sovereign French people and voted on them when it decided on the constitution. And that will continue to be the case as far as the powers of the French president are. Now, when we're talking about European policy, it's European rules that prevail. But if you like democracy and sovereignty, that doesn't mean then that you should be mixing up all the rules and everything we have in common. And finally, I won't dwell on the subject of Syria because I spoke about it earlier. The heart of our action in France for months has been diplomatic humanitarian action and preparing for the follow-up. As of the Security Council meetings on several occasions, we adopted a resolution for the ceasefire and humanitarian access, but that wasn't respected. But Russia had signed up to the 2901 a few weeks ago. As of the next day, we continue to pursue those diplomatic channels, and we're on the ground with the NGOs doing humanitarian work and the support that we announced yesterday. We've constantly been trying to prepare for the follow-up. As I said before the UN General Assembly, we, together with a small group, have involved several countries in the region to prepare for the Syria of tomorrow, and in particular those countries where there are millions of Syrian refugees. They need our help: Jordan, Lebanon and Turkey. So I think that's what's going on in Syria, and I want to remind you of that. And then on energy policy, just a couple of words. First of all, I fully share your concerns about Nord Stream 2, and I have to say Chancellor Merkel expressed exactly that view a few days ago and recognized just how sensitive this is, because it calls into question our collective energy sovereignty with respect to Russia. As far as I'm concerned, the energy policy we should pursue, and here I can answer the Franco-German question, what we need is an energy policy that is in line with our commitment to bring down CO2 emissions. We need an energy policy that guarantees security of supply to Europe. If we don't respect that, it won't be possible. The French strategy has been to stick to these lines of action. Now, some people don't like nuclear energy. I hear that. However, it doesn't emit CO2 and much less than coal. Now, of course, we shouldn't depend on nuclear too much. In fact, my predecessor had engaged in a transition policy, which we very much want to pursue and support. But France will have a very clear line here. Our desire is to continue to push forward with renewables to a greater extent, to improve the mix, and to do that with European countries, to improve interconnections which allow us to better use those energies. However, our desire is not to lose any ground with respect to our energy sovereignty. That's important for the future, and the sovereignty of our neighbouring countries as well. Well, yes, of course you can stoke up fears. All I'm saying is that we have a very demanding security authority, and in the last few years, including incidents we've seen very far afield, I haven't seen any victims or fatalities with respect to other energies. So we have to have security of supply. We have to reduce the fossil fuel proportion, also reduce the proportion of nuclear, but we have to maintain sovereignty. If closing plants means you then open coal plants, unfortunately that's happened in Germany, means your CO2 balance is going to suffer, and that's clashing with the Paris Agreement. And if we speed up along this path without bearing in mind security of supply, and it means you're dependent with respect to non-European powers, for example Russia, for your energy, that's not a good decision. So I fully stand by our energy policy, whose absolute priority has to be to reduce emissions, and that's why I've decided to close all coal plants and thermal or heat plants in this 5-year period. That law has been adopted, they'll all be closed. And having a transition in the area of mobility, we need to then go much further with this and increase with the increase of price of fuel and a convergence of the fuel price and increased investment in renewables. That's absolutely essential, and it will mean that as Nicolas Hulot, the Minister of State, said a few months ago, we'll be able to bring down the proportion of nuclear. That's our strategy, because it means we can bring down emissions and stick to energy sovereignty. These are the two lines I will pursue, and I will not bow down to any policies wanting us to bring down or not bring down CO2 emissions or be further dependent.
Union économique et monétaire.
Then on economic
L'intégration.
Now, let me tell you, there is already a Europe with a number of different speeds. There's a Europe of the Eurozone, there's a Europe of Schengen, so there's already a number of different speeds here in Europe. What our moral duty is, though, I believe, is that we should not say the club is closed. And we're not just going to decide in this way who we work with or not. If we want to move forward in Europe, those who have more ambition and more will should be able to move forward. That's how Europe has always progressed. If we had always waited for the whole of the club to be ready, sorry, you wouldn't all be here. Europe was born from the ambition of the few who took some sometimes crazy risks, and I think we need to continue in this vein. So I want to see more ambition for our economic and monetary union. Yes, in the short term, we need to prioritise our commitments in the banking union, and we need to go to the end of what was decided a number of years ago. Yes, at the level of our countries as well, we have to take the reforms which are in line with the European semester. These are our commitments, the responsibility we have as member states. That's what I decided for France and what I proposed to the French people during the election. We need to move forward to more solidarity within this union as well. What is particularly problematic at the Eurozone level is that we have instruments in terms of responsibility, but we have not taken decisions in terms of solidarity. There is no monetary area in the world that works under the constraints of a single currency with legitimate domestic reforms without a budgetary capacity that allows investment, that allows convergence or stabilization. So this project that I am defending now is one I want to work on with Chancellor Merkel and with all of the partners within the Eurozone as well as outside of the Eurozone. The final objective of the discussion is that other countries, if they wish, can join as well. So we need to have regular discussions within the Eurozone, but also in a broader perspective as well. We need to move towards a type of politics that isn't just intergovernmental. We have these tools, we have these policies. This will of course involve member states and governments, but there needs to be community structures put in place as well. So that's why I welcome these proposals. We need to go further. I welcome what the President of the Commission said. There has been this thought process when it comes to the Eurozone that we have the principle of democratic governance within the Eurozone. There needs to be representation of the parliamentarians here when it comes to certain subjects in the Eurozone. There will be extremely important issues here, and there will need to be a certain democratic oversight, and the Parliament will of course be involved. There'll be a type of executive which will have competences, which will have a mandate, and this cannot simply remain at an intergovernmental level. So we'll have to find a path to see how we can move forward to a more institutional, democratic system, a more integrated system, and those who want to be can be involved in this integration project. It's something we need to decide in the next few months to make this organisation and institutional progress that will allow us to have greater stability, more capacity for investment. If we don't do that, we won't be able to move forward in Europe. Now, there was a lot of other different subjects. I know I've well overshot my time here, but I did want to take up the opportunity to talk about gender equality, an issue that was raised. It's a subject I have always defended. I talked about it during my election campaign. There's a law currently going through in France. I'm fully committed to this issue. On the proposals and the directive, I approve the principle here, but parental leave paid for in this way could end up being very expensive and very difficult to actually manage. We want to see parental leave. We want to work on the spouse who doesn't get to benefit from that so much. We need to have an ambitious, equal project, but we can't have this paid through systems which should lead to imbalances. So I improve the principles, but how this would work, for example, within the French system, this would lead to explosive costs. We are going to make a proposal going along the same lines, but I absolutely believe in equality, and I think we will work on parental leave within this scope. Now, on our Europe of defence and our defence policy, we, France, we believe in this defence policy. Verhofstadt talked about the French Assembly that saw these projects a long time ago, but now we have made a lot of progress, and I welcome that progress. An agreement has now been found because the Commission has pushed an ambitious project, and you are working on this as well through the European Defence Fund. I would like us to really fulfil our ambition in this area. This is also a sovereign subject. France will always be at the side of any member state when their sovereignty is attacked. That's a decision we made from the very first day, together with the UK with the Skripal affair. This is something we have shown when Greece is threatened in the Eastern Mediterranean. I spoke to Mr. Tsipras just a few days ago, and we will continue to maintain this position. This is at the heart of our sovereignty, to have this solidarity amongst us. So, ladies and gentlemen, I won't have replied to all of your questions, but I tried to be as comprehensive as possible. I was very happy to be able to do this here in Strasbourg. In Strasbourg, we will also open a European university, as we have in many areas. I am very proud of Strasbourg, and I am very pleased that you honour this city with your presence. Thank you very much.
Merci beaucoup, Monsieur le Président.
Thank you very much, President. Once again, the Parliament has been at the heart of democratic debate on the future of Europe. Thank you very much for having accepted to come along and engage in a genuine debate with members of the European Parliament. The debate is now closed, and we'll start with the votes.